the specific way the light hit Sergeant Miller's cuticles, a faint, bruised lavender that didn't match his oxygen saturation, was the first thing Major Elena Vance noted at 0415, while the rest of Landstuhl Regional Medical Center was still dreaming of home. It was a Monday in late October, the kind of wet, bone-chilling morning in Germany where the fog rolls off the hills and swallows the flight line whole, turning the massive C-17s into ghosts. Elena had been awake for 19 hours, her third consecutive shift covering for a captain whose wife had gone into early labor in Ramstein. She didn't mind the hours. The hours were predictable. It was the lavender under the fingernails of a man who was supposed to be recovering from a routine shrapnel extraction that made the hair on her arms stand up. Sergeant First Class Christopher Miller, 3rd Ranger Battalion, was 24 years old and built like a brick house from a life spent in the woods of northern Georgia. He'd taken a piece of a mortar round in his thigh 3 days ago during a training exercise in a corner of the world the Pentagon wasn't talking about yet. The surgery had been textbook. The wound was clean. According to the charts, he should have been asking the nurses for extra pudding and complaining about the lack of decent coffee. Instead, he was staring at the ceiling with eyes that seemed to be struggling to focus on the fluorescent light fixture. Elena didn't reach for his chart first. She reached for his hand. Her own hands were steady, the skin scrubbed raw from years of surgical soap, the wedding ring she no longer wore replaced by a thin, pale indentation on her finger. She felt his pulse. It wasn't just fast, it was thready, a frantic, vibrating beat like a trapped bird. "Chris," she said, her voice low and even. She didn't use his rank. In the quiet of the 0400 hour, ranks felt like armor that had been stripped away. "Tell me about your head. Does it feel heavy?" Miller's eyes shifted toward her. He swallowed, a hard, dry sound. "Like it's full of wet sand, ma'am, and the light, it's too loud." Elena narrowed her eyes. Light wasn't loud unless your meninges were screaming or your brain was swelling. She checked his pupils. They were sluggish. She moved her hand to his abdomen, pressing down on the right upper quadrant. Miller didn't flinch, but she felt the rigidity. The liver was guarded. She grew up in Marfa, Texas, a place where the horizon was a straight line, and the silence was so thick you could hear a rattlesnake's heart beat if you sat still enough. Her father had been a large animal vet, a man who could look at a heifer 100 yards away and tell you it had a magnesium deficiency just by the way it shifted its weight. He taught her that the body never lies, but it often whispers. Most people wait for it to scream. Elena Vance had made a career out of listening to the whispers. She stood up and walked to the nurse's station, the squeak of her rubber-soled clogs the only sound in the hallway. The night shift lead, a seasoned master sergeant named Benitez, looked up from a stack of requisitions. "He's not right, Benitez," Elena said, her voice a flat, controlled instrument. Benitez frowned, glancing at the monitor at the station. "Vitals are within parameters, Major. Heart rate is 98, O2 is 96 on room air. He's just hitting the post-op wall." "Look at his hands next time you're in there," Elena said, "and call the lab. I want a full metabolic panel LFTs, and I want a blood smear, manual count." Benitez paused, his pen hovering over the paper. "A manual count? Pathology is going to complain. They're backed up with the arrivals from the med evac out of Djibouti." "Let them complain," Elena said. "Tell them it's an Army major's request, and if they have a problem, they can call my cell. I'll be in the lounge for exactly 11 minutes drinking the worst coffee in the European command." She didn't wait for a response. She walked to the lounge, her gait precise, her shoulders squared. She was a woman who lived in the margins of her own life. At 38, she had a chest full of medals she never wore and a reputation for being difficult, which was military code for a woman who didn't apologize for being right. Her divorce had been finalized 18 months ago, a casualty of 3 deployments, and a husband who wanted a wife who was present, rather than a wife who was saving the world one internal hemorrhage at a time. She didn't blame him. Sometimes she didn't feel present in her own skin either. She felt like a collection of data points and diagnostic intuitions, a machine designed to find the flaw in the human engine. The lounge smelled of burnt beans and industrial-strength floor wax. Sitting in the corner, hunched over a tablet, was Chief Warrant Officer for Silas Thorne. Thorne was 60 going on 80, a lab technician who had seen everything from the first cases of HIV in the 80s to the strange, lingering toxins of the Gulf War. He was the only person in the hospital who saw Elena clearly. "You look like you're hunting something, Vance," Thorne said without looking up. "Sergeant Miller in 412, she said, pouring a cup of liquid charcoal into a foam cup. Post-op day 3, shrapnel leg. But his cuticles are lavender and his liver is talking to me. Thorne looked up then, his eyes sharp behind thick lenses. Talking how? Guarding, silent. He said the light was loud. Thorne grunted, his fingers tapping the side of his tablet. I'll run the smear myself. The kids downstairs don't know how to look for the weird stuff anymore. They just trust the machines. Machines don't see colors, they see numbers. Thank you, Silas. Don't thank me yet. If you're right, and you're usually right, it means something came back with him that wasn't on the manifest, and the new guy isn't going to like that. Elena took a sip of the coffee, ignoring the way it burned her tongue. The new guy? Colonel Sterling, arrived yesterday from Walter Reed. He's the new chief of clinical services. Ivy League, three-piece suit under his lab coat, probably has a direct line to the Surgeon General. He's already been through the wards twice, checking the dust on the picture frames. Elena felt a familiar tightening in her chest. A new administrator was the last thing Landstuhl needed. This was a transition point, a place of blood and trauma where the rules of a pristine stateside hospital often fractured against the reality of a soldier who had been lying in the dirt for 6 hours before seeing a medic. I don't care about his pedigree, Silas. I care about Miller's liver. Well, Thorne said, standing up and stretching his back until it popped. Sterling cares about standard of care, and your standard of intuition is going to be a hard sell to a man who thinks medicine is a math equation. Elena watched him leave, then leaned her head back against the cold cinder block wall. She closed her eyes and visualized the human circulatory system. She traced the path of the shrapnel in Miller's leg. She thought about the literal zones of the African coast where his unit had been operating. There was a pattern here, a ghost in the machine. She could feel it, a low-frequency hum of danger that didn't fit the clinical narrative. An hour later, the sun was a bruised orange smear on the horizon, and the hospital was waking up. The shift change was a choreographed chaos of handovers and whispered updates. Elena was back at Miller's bedside when she heard the sound of polished boots on the linoleum. It wasn't the soft scuff of a nurse or the heavy thud of a combat boot. It was the rhythmic, arrogant click of a man who wanted to be heard before he was seen. Colonel Marcus Sterling entered room 412 with a retinue of 3 residents and the head nurse. He was impeccably groomed, his silver hair cut to a precise military taper, his lab coat white enough to be blinding. He didn't look at Miller. He looked at the chart at the foot of the bed. Major Vance, Sterling said, his voice a rich, practiced baritone. I was told I'd find you here. You've been on duty for 19 hours, 20? 19, Colonel, Elena said, not moving from her spot by Miller's head. Admirable, Sterling said, though his tone suggested it was anything but. But we have protocols for a reason, Major. Fatigue leads to errors. Errors lead to liabilities. Why hasn't this patient been cleared for transfer to the VA in Augusta? His surgical site is healing well. We need the bed for the incoming from the Mediterranean. He's not stable for transfer, Elena said. Sterling paused, a small, patronizing smile touching his lips. He looked at the monitors. Heart rate 95, BP 120/80, temp 99. 1. In what world, Major, is that unstable? In the world where his neurological status is declining and his liver is beginning to sequester blood, Elena said. She pointed to Miller's hand. Look at the nail beds, Colonel. Look at the capillary refill. Sterling didn't lean in. He didn't touch the patient. He stayed in his circle of authority. I see a soldier who has been through a traumatic event and is likely experiencing a standard inflammatory response, perhaps a touch of post-traumatic stress. What I don't see is a reason to tie up a level 1 trauma bed because of a feeling about his cuticles. It's not a feeling, Elena said, her voice dropping an octave. This was the controlled rage, the cold, hard diamond of her competence being ground against the sandpaper of his ego. I've ordered a manual smear and a full metabolic workup. I suspect an atypical presentation of a Rift Valley variant or something else he picked up in the brush. His unit was in a high-risk zone. Sterling let out a short, sharp laugh. He turned to the residents who were looking at their shoes. You see, gentlemen, this is the danger of the frontier medic mentality. Major Vance wants to find a rare, exotic disease where a simple case of post-operative fatigue exists. It's more exciting, isn't it? More cinematic. He turned back to Elena, his eyes hardening. Cancel the manual labs, Major. They are a drain on resources we don't have. Sergeant Miller will be prepped for the 1400 transport to Augusta. That is an order. Elena stood her ground. She was 5'6", but in that moment she felt like she occupied every inch of the room. Colonel, if you put that man on a pressurized flight for 8 hours, he will be dead before you hit the Atlantic coast. His intracranial pressure is rising. I am not clearing him." The room went silent. The hum of the HVAC system seemed to grow louder. To defy a direct order in front of junior officers was the third rail of military life. Sterling stepped closer, invading her personal space. He smelled of expensive cologne and peppermint. "Major Vance, you are exhausted. I am attributing your insubordination to delirium. You will go to your quarters. You will sleep. And you will not set foot on this ward again until you are ready to follow the chain of command. Am I clear?" Elena looked at Miller. The young man's eyes were rolled back slightly now, his breathing becoming rhythmic and shallow, Cheyne-Stokes breathing, the sound of a brain beginning to fail. "He's dying, Colonel," she said, her voice a whisper. "He is recovering," Sterling snapped. "Now get out." Elena didn't beg, she didn't argue. She looked at Benitez, who was standing by the door with a look of profound discomfort. She looked at the residents, who were learning exactly the wrong lesson about what it meant to be a doctor. Then she turned and walked out. She didn't go to her quarters. She walked straight to the pathology lab in the basement. The air down here was colder, smelling of formaldehyde and the ozone of the centrifuges. Silas Thorne was standing over a microscope, his back hunched like a gargoyle. "He's sending him to Augusta," Elena said, leaning against the cold metal lab table. Thorne didn't look up. "I heard the grapevine in this building is faster than the fiber optic cables. Did you find it, Silas?" Thorne stepped back from the microscope. He looked tired, not just long shift tired, but long life tired. He gestured for her to look. Elena leaned in. She adjusted the fine focus. At first it looked like a standard blood smear, the red blood cells like tiny pink donuts. But then she saw them. Small, faint, ring-like structures, but they weren't malaria. They were elongated, almost like a shepherd's crook, hiding inside the cells, tearing them apart from the inside out. It was subtle. If a machine had scanned this, it would have flagged the low count, but it wouldn't have known what the structures were. "Babesia," she whispered. "Not any strain I've seen," Thorne said. "And look at the platelets, or the lack of them. They're clumping in the periphery. He's not just sick, Elena. He's in a state of disseminated intravascular coagulation. He's bleeding out into his own tissues, but it's all happening internally. The shrapnel wound was a red herring. It just gave the pathogen a doorway." "Sterling canceled the labs," Elena said, her heart hammering against her ribs. "He's loading him on a plane in 6 hours. Then you have 6 hours to find a way to stop him," Thorne said, "because if that kid gets in the air, the pressure change will turn his brain into a sponge." Elena looked at the slide again. She felt a wave of nausea, followed by a surge of that dark, cold competence that had gotten her through a dozen mass casualty events in Kandahar. She wasn't just a major. She wasn't just a doctor. She was the only person who knew the truth, and the truth was currently being packed for transport by a man who was more worried about his promotion than his patient. She left the lab and headed for the medical library, a small, cramped room filled with physical journals that no one touched anymore. She needed the specific literature on the littoral zones of the sub-Saharan coast. She needed a case study. She needed a weapon. As she worked, the hospital hummed around her. She heard the announcements over the intercom. She heard the distant roar of the C-17s taking off, taking the lucky ones home. Every time a plane left, she felt a phantom pain in her own skull, imagining Miller's brain pressing against the bone. At 1100, she found it. A paper from a Belgian tropical medicine journal, 1994. A small outbreak in a remote fishing village. Symptoms: lavender cuticles, loud light, guarded liver. Mortality rate, 98%. The only survivors had been treated with an aggressive, off-label regimen of an antiparasitic usually reserved for livestock, combined with high-dose steroids. It was a long shot. It was a career-ending move. She checked her watch. 3 hours until Miller was moved. She walked back to Ward 4. She didn't hide. She walked with the purpose of a woman who had already accepted the cost of her actions. The ward was busier now. The day shift was in full swing. She saw the transport team, 2 medics with a high-stakes gurney, waiting near Miller's room. Sterling was there too, standing at the nursing station, signing off on the transfer orders with a flourish of his gold-plated pen. Elena approached the station. The nurses went quiet. Sterling looked up, his eyebrows arching. "Major Vance, I thought I made myself clear. You are on mandatory leave." "I found it, Colonel," Elena said. She laid the printed journal article on the desk over his orders. "It's a rare protozoal infection, *Leptoplasmodium marinus*. It mimics surgical trauma and triggers a cytokine storm." If you move him, his cerebral edema will spike. He needs an immediate loading dose of moxidectin and Roman 4 dexamethasone. Sterling didn't even look at the paper. He looked at her, his expression one of pity. Major, you have spent your morning obsessing over a 30-year-old Belgian paper while I have been managing the clinical flow of this entire facility. The transport team is here. Sergeant Miller is going to Georgia, and you are going to the Provost Marshal's office if you don't step away from that desk. Colonel, look at the patient, Elena said, her voice rising just enough to catch the attention of the transport medics. Look at him right now. In room 412, the monitors began to wail. It wasn't a subtle sound. It was the sharp, rhythmic scream of a flatline. Elena was the first one in the room. She didn't wait for Sterling. She didn't wait for permission. She saw Miller's body seizing, his back arching off the bed in a classic decerebrate posture, the sign of a brain stem being crushed by pressure. Get the crash cart, she yelled, and get me the moxidectin from the veterinary supply in the basement. Now. Stop. Sterling's voice boomed from the doorway. He pushed his way into the room, his face flushed with anger. This is a standard seizure. Administer 5 of Valium and get him on the gurney. We are not using veterinary drugs on a United States soldier based on the delusions of an exhausted officer. He's not seizing from epilepsy, you idiot. Elena screamed, the control finally snapping. He's herniating. His brain is being pushed out of the base of his skull. She grabbed a manual suction pump and began to clear Miller's airway. The young man was foaming at the mouth, a pinkish, frothy fluid that smelled like old copper. Move aside, Major, Sterling said, grabbing her arm. Elena didn't think. She threw her elbow back, catching Sterling in the chest and sending him stumbling into the Roman 4 pole. Touch me again and I'll have you up for criminal negligence before the sun sets, she hissed. The room was a blur of motion. Nurses were crying out. The transport medics stood frozen. Elena was over Miller, her hands moving with a precision that defied her 20 hours of wakefulness. She was performing a bedside burr hole, a desperate last-ditch effort to relieve the pressure in his skull with a manual drill from the emergency kit. Vance, stop! Sterling was back on his feet, his voice shaking with rage. You are relieved, you are under arrest. Medics, restrain her. The medics moved forward, but they stopped when they saw the look on Elena's face. It wasn't the look of a crazy woman. It was the look of a woman who was seeing something they couldn't. She felt the drill give way. A spray of dark, pressurized blood hit her lab coat, staining the white fabric a deep, morbid crimson. Miller's body went limp. The monitors didn't stop screaming. Major, Benitez whispered from the door. Major, he's gone. Elena kept her hand on the drill. She watched the dark blood spill onto the white sheets. She felt the silence of the room settle over her like a shroud. Sterling was standing by the foot of the bed, his chest heaving. He straightened his tie. He looked around the room, making sure everyone saw his composure in the face of her madness. I hope you've enjoyed your career, Major Vance, Sterling said, his voice cold and precise. Because it ended 2 minutes ago. You killed a soldier in front of a dozen witnesses while defying a direct order. You will be lucky if you don't spend the next 20 years in Leavenworth. Elena didn't look at him. She looked at Miller's hand. The lavender under the cuticles was turning a dark, bruised black. I didn't kill him, she said, her voice hollow. The thing inside him did. And now, Colonel, you're the one who has to tell his mother why you wouldn't let me treat it. I am the Chief of Clinical Services, Sterling said, turning to the head nurse. Secure the room, notify the CID, and get this woman out of my sight. 2 MPs arrived minutes later. They were young, their faces tight with the awkwardness of arresting an officer. Elena didn't resist. She didn't say a word as they escorted her down the hallway, past the staring eyes of the staff, past the rows of wounded soldiers who didn't know that the system had just failed one of their own. She was taken to a small, windowless holding room in the administrative wing. They didn't take her rank, not yet, but they took her phone and her ID. She sat in a hard plastic chair, the blood on her lab coat drying into a stiff, dark crust. She didn't wash her hands. She wanted to feel the weight of it. The hours passed in a vacuum. She thought about Marfa. She thought about the way the desert air felt at dusk, the way you could see a storm coming from 50 miles away. She had seen this storm coming. She had called out the warning, and the world had simply closed its windows and told her she was imagining things. She wasn't afraid. She was beyond fear. She was in the cold, quiet place where the only thing that mattered was the data. At 1800, the door opened. It wasn't an MP. It was Silas Thorne. He looked older than he had that morning, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his uniform. He's in the morgue, Thorne said, sitting down across from her. I know, Elena said. Sterling is pushing for an immediate court-martial. He's already filed the paperwork. He's calling it a psychotic break brought on by combat fatigue. Elena let out a dry, hacking laugh. Is that what we're calling it now, being right? He's powerful, Elena. He has the ear of the general. He's framing the narrative. He's saying Miller was stable until you interfered. He wasn't stable, Silas. He was a ticking bomb. Thorne leaned forward, his voice a low rasp. I know that, you know that. But the only way to prove it is the autopsy, and Sterling just ordered a restricted post-mortem. He wants a limited exam, just the surgical site, just the head wound you caused. Elena felt the first spark of real terror. He's going to bury it. He's going to bury the pathogen with the boy. Not if I have anything to do with it, Thorne said. But I'm a warrant officer, Elena. I can't override a colonel's signature. Only a medical examiner or a direct order from command can do that. The general won't listen to me, Elena said. I'm the crazy major who assaulted a superior officer. Then don't talk to the general, Thorne said. He slid a small, folded piece of paper across the table. Talk to the man who was in the foxhole with him. Elena opened the paper. It was a name and a room number. Who is this? Staff Sergeant Elias Vance. No relation, I checked. He's in the recovery ward. He was Miller's squad leader. He saw what happened in the brush, and he's been asking why his best friend is in a body bag. How am I supposed to get to him? I'm under guard. Thorne stood up. He walked to the door and looked out at the MP standing in the hallway. The MP was a 20-year-old kid named Henderson. Henderson? Thorne barked. The MP snapped to attention. Yes, Chief. Major Vance needs to use the latrine, and since there isn't one in this box, I'm taking her to the one down the hall. You can follow us if you want to stand outside a women's restroom and explain to the nurses why you're peeping. Henderson blushed a deep red. No, Chief, I'll stay here, just be quick. Thorne looked at Elena. You have 10 minutes, make them count. Elena stood up. She felt the fatigue in her bones, the leaden weight of her muscles. But as she stepped out into the hallway, she felt something else. A flicker of hope, sharp and dangerous as a razor blade. She didn't go to the latrine. She slipped through the side door of the administrative wing and into the main hospital corridor. She knew the layout of Landstuhl better than she knew the back of her own hand. She moved through the shadows, avoiding the main elevators, taking the service stairs that smelled of laundry and trash. The recovery ward was a long, open room filled with the sounds of humming machines and the occasional groan of a man in pain. She found room 302. Staff Sergeant Elias Vance was sitting up in bed, his arm in a sling, his face mapped with small, jagged scars from a grenade blast. He looked up as she entered, his eyes narrowing. You're the doctor, he said. His voice was like gravel. The one who tried to save Chris. I'm Major Vance, she said, stepping into the light. I need to know what happened in the literal, Sergeant, and I need you to be honest because the man who killed your friend is trying to hide the reason he died. Elias Vance looked at her for a long time. He saw the blood on her coat. He saw the exhaustion in her eyes. He saw the truth. It wasn't a training exercise, he said softly. We were in a village near the coast. There were these flies, thousands of them, and the water. It was the color of a bruise. Chris fell in during a skirmish. He cut his leg on some rusted metal in the silt. He started feeling off 24 hours later, but he wouldn't tell the medic. He didn't want to be sidelined. Did anyone else fall in? Just him. But we all drank the local water before the purifiers were set up. Why? Is it happening to us too? Maybe, Elena said, but I can't know for sure unless I get a full autopsy on Chris. I need his next of kin to demand it. The hospital is trying to limit the exam. Elias's jaw tightened. His mother is in Macon. She's a widow. She'll do whatever I tell her to do. She trusts me. Then call her, Elena said, handing him her backup burner phone she kept in her pocket, a habit from her days in the field. Tell her she needs to request a full forensic autopsy by an outside examiner. Tell her it's the only way to get justice for her son. Elias took the phone. What happens to you if I do this? Elena looked at the door. She could hear the voices of the MPs in the hallway. They had realized she was gone. It doesn't matter what happens to me, she said. It matters what's in his blood. She turned to leave, but Elias caught her hand. Major? Yes, Sergeant. Thank you for not looking away. Elena nodded, a sharp, quick movement. She stepped out into the hallway just as Henderson and another MP rounded the corner. Major Vance? Henderson yelled, his hand going to his holster. Elena didn't run. She stood in the center of the hallway, her hands empty, her head held high. She watched them approach, her expression one of absolute, unshakable calm. I'm done, she said. They took her back to the holding room, but this time they cuffed her. The metal was cold against her wrists, a physical manifestation of the system closing in. An hour later, Sterling entered the room. He looked triumphant. He held a folder in his hand like a trophy. "The CID has finished their initial interview with the staff," he said. "The consensus is clear, Major. You acted outside of your authority, you used unapproved medical procedures, and you caused the death of a soldier. The General has signed the order for your immediate detention." "Did you hear from the family, Colonel?" Elena asked, her voice steady. Sterling's smile flickered. "The family is being notified. It's a tragic loss, but it's a closed case." The phone on the table began to buzz. It was Sterling's phone. He frowned and picked it up. "Colonel Sterling, yes, sir, I understand, but yes, sir." He hung up. His face had gone a strange, sickly shade of gray. "What is it, Colonel?" Elena asked, though she already knew. "The mother," Sterling whispered. "She's hired a private attorney. She's demanding a full forensic autopsy, and she's requested the presence of a civilian pathologist from the CDC. Elena leaned back in her chair, the handcuffs clinking softly. "It sounds like you're going to have a very busy morning, Colonel. I hope you've kept your notes in order." "This changes nothing," Sterling snapped, though his voice lacked its previous conviction. "The autopsy will show exactly what I said, a surgical complication and a traumatic brain injury caused by your drill." "We'll see," Elena said. "The body never lies, Colonel. It just takes someone with the courage to listen." Sterling walked out, slamming the door behind him. Elena was left in the silence. She closed her eyes. She thought about Sergeant Miller. She thought about the lavender under his cuticles. She thought about the tiny shepherd crook structures hiding in his cells, waiting to be found. She was a major in the United States Army. She was a doctor. She was a pariah. And as the rain began to lash against the small, high window of the holding room, she knew that the battle hadn't ended with Miller's last breath. It was only just beginning. The truth was buried in a cold room in the basement, and she was the only one who knew how to dig it out. The cliffhanger wasn't whether she would be vindicated. The cliffhanger was what would happen to the rest of the 3rd Ranger Battalion if she wasn't. Because if Elias Vance was right, and they had all drunk that water, there were 200 more ticking bombs currently flying back to the United States. And the only person who could stop them was sitting in a holding room, waiting for a dead man to speak. The silence of the holding room was not empty. It was a pressurized wait, the kind that precedes a deep-sea implosion. Elena sat with her back against the cinder-block wall, her wrists anchored by the cold, biting steel of the Smith & Wesson Peerless handcuffs. They were standard issue, ratcheted tight enough to leave a permanent memory on her skin. She didn't struggle. To struggle was to acknowledge the system's power to frighten her, and Elena Vance had long ago traded fear for a calculated, clinical observation of her own demise. The dried blood on her lab coat had turned the color of rust. It felt stiff, a second skin that crackled whenever she took a breath. Through the small, reinforced window of the heavy steel door, she could see the blurred motion of the hallway, the flickering of fluorescent lights, the passing shadow of the MP, Henderson, whose boots squeaked with an agonizing, rhythmic hesitancy. He didn't want to be there. He was a kid from a suburb in Ohio who had joined the army to see the world, not to guard a decorated major who had just performed a medieval medical procedure on a dying ranger. She closed her eyes and focused on the sound of the rain against the vent. It was a steady, percussive thrum, the heartbeat of the German autumn. In her mind, she wasn't in a holding cell at Landstuhl. She was back in the lab, looking through Silas Thorne's microscope. She could still see the shepherd's crook structures, asterisk leptoplasmodium marinus asterisk. It was a name that sounded almost elegant, like something you'd find in a poetry book, but the reality was a biological wildfire. It didn't just infect, it hijacked. It utilized the host's own inflammatory response to accelerate its replication. The more the body fought, the faster the parasite won. The door groaned open. It wasn't Sterling. It was a woman in a charcoal gray suit, her hair pulled back into a bun so tight it seemed to pull the skin of her forehead smooth. She carried a leather briefcase and a look of practiced, weary neutrality. Behind her stood a JAG officer, a captain whose uniform was so crisp it looked like it had been carved from granite. "Major Vance," the woman said, sitting down across from her. She didn't offer a hand. "I'm Special Agent Miller, no relation to the deceased, with the CID. This is Captain Holloway from the Trial Defense Service. He's here to ensure your rights are protected, though given the circumstances, that's going to be a difficult task." Elena looked at Holloway, then back at the agent. "Did the family's request for the autopsy clear?" The agent blinked, momentarily thrown by the lack of defensive posture. "The request is being processed, but that's not why we're here. We're here because Colonel Sterling has filed a formal complaint alleging a psychotic break, aggravated assault on a superior officer, and involuntary manslaughter. He's requested a 706 sanity board immediately. Elena's lips thinned. A 706 was the military's way of erasing a person before the trial even began. If they could prove she was mentally unstable, her testimony about the pathogen, the neglect, and the diagnostic failures would be legally voided. It was a surgical strike. Sterling wasn't just covering his tracks, he was burning the map. "I'm sane, Agent Miller," Elena said, her voice a low, steady hum. "And I'm the only person in this hospital who knows why Sergeant Miller is dead. If you proceed with the 706, you're not just silencing me, you're sentencing the rest of his unit to the same fate." Captain Holloway cleared his throat. "Major, as your counsel, I strongly advise you to remain silent. Anything you say about the patient's condition or your actions in room 412 can and will be used to substantiate the colonel's claims of erratic behavior." Elena turned her gaze to the captain. "Elias Vance, Staff Sergeant, 3rd Ranger Battalion. He's in Ward 3. Have you checked on him?" Holloway frowned. "The squad leader, he's being treated for minor shrapnel wounds and blast concussion. He's fine." "He's not fine," Elena said. "He was in the water, he told me. The flies, the silt, the color of the river. He's the index for the next wave. If you don't get a blood smear to Sela's thorn in the next 4 hours, Elias Vance will be in the morgue by dawn, and he won't be the last." Agent Miller leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "Major, the medical records show no evidence of an infectious outbreak. The official report from the field indicates a standard training exercise with no biological hazards identified. You're chasing ghosts." The field report was written by people who didn't want to admit they sent a ranger element into a contaminated littoral zone without a biological survey, Elena said. "It's easier to call it a training accident than a failure of intelligence. But the biology doesn't care about the paperwork. The parasite is already in the C-17s. It's on its way to Georgia. If those men disperse to their families, you're not looking at a military incident. You're looking at a public health catastrophe." The room went silent. Agent Miller looked at the JAG officer. There was a flicker of something in her eyes, not belief, but the specific kind of doubt that haunts people who have seen how often the official story is a lie. "We'll take your statement under advisement," Miller said, standing up. "But for now, Major, you're being transferred to the psychiatric annex for observation, under guard." Elena didn't move. She felt the weight of the system pressing down on her, the quiet, grinding failure of an institution that had decided what she was. A tired, hysterical woman, before she could show them the truth. It was infuriating, but she didn't let the heat reach her face. She kept it in her chest, where it could stay cold, where it could stay useful. As they led her out of the room, the handcuffs were replaced with soft restraints, the kind version of a leash. 2 MPs flanked her, their faces masks of professional indifference. They didn't take the main elevators. They took the service route, past the humming industrial laundry machines and the kitchens that smelled of greasy Salisbury steak and floor cleaner. As they crossed the threshold into the psychiatric annex, Elena saw a figure standing in the shadows of the loading dock. It was Sela's Thorn. He was holding a clipboard, pretending to check a manifest of incoming supplies. As Elena passed, their eyes met for a fraction of a second. Sela's didn't nod. He didn't wave. He simply tapped the side of his glasses twice. It was a code they had developed 3 years ago in a dusty, sun-bleached clinic in Djibouti. Asterisk, I see it. I'm on it. Asterisk, the psychiatric annex was a world of muted colors and soft edges. There were no sharp corners, no glass that wasn't reinforced, no sounds that weren't dampened by the thick acoustic carpeting. It was a place designed to make you feel like you were underwater. Elena was placed in a room that was essentially a high-end padded cell, a bed bolted to the floor, a sink with no exposed pipes, and a camera that watched her from the ceiling with a small, unblinking red eye. She sat on the edge of the bed and waited. She didn't have a watch, but she counted her breaths. 1,800 breaths was roughly 30 minutes. She was on her 3rd cycle when the door opened. It wasn't a doctor. It was a nurse she didn't recognize, a tall, thin man with a nervous twitch in his hands. He was carrying a tray of medication, 2 small white pills in a plastic cup and a paper cup of water. "Major Vance," he said, his voice shaky. "I'm Corporal Reed. I'm supposed to give you these to help you sleep." Elena looked at the pills. They weren't sleep aids. They were high-dose thorazine, enough to turn her brain into mush for the next 12 hours. "Who ordered these, Corporal?" she asked, her voice calm. Colonel Sterling's office, Reed said, not looking her in the eye. He said you were agitated. Elena stood up. She was a head shorter than Reed, but she moved into his space with the predatory grace of someone who had spent her life in high-stakes environments. Reed, look at me. The corporal looked up, his eyes wide. You're a medic, aren't you? Elena asked. Yes, ma'am. Then you know the smell of a cytokine storm. You've been on the wards. You've seen the way the body reacts when it's fighting something it can't see. Reed swallowed hard. I heard about Sergeant Miller. People are talking. Let them talk, Elena said. But you need to listen. In about 2 hours, Staff Sergeant Elena Vance in Ward 3 is going to start showing symptoms. He'll have a low-grade fever, lavender nail beds, and he'll complain that the light is too loud. When that happens, Sterling is going to tell the staff it's a sympathy reaction. He'll tell them it's psychological. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a blade. It's not. It's the parasite. If you give me those pills, you're helping him kill that man. Is that why you joined the AIMED, Reed? To help a colonel bury a ranger? Reed's hands began to tremble violently. The tray rattled. He looked at the camera, then back at Elena. What do? I have orders. You're going to accidentally drop those pills down the drain, Elena said. And then you're going to go to the lab. You're going to find Silas Thorne. Tell him the shepherd is in the field. He'll know what it means. Reed stared at her for a long, agonizing moment. The silence in the room was thick enough to choke on. Then, with a sudden, jerky movement, he turned to the sink. He tossed the pills into the drain and turned on the water, watching them dissolve and disappear into the dark. I didn't see anything, he whispered. You did the right thing, Corporal, Elena said. He left the room without another word, the door clicking shut with a finality that felt like a gavel. Elena went back to the bed. She didn't sleep. She sat in the dark, her mind a map of the hospital's infrastructure. She knew where the vents led. She knew the shift changes. She knew that the system was slow, but once it decided to crush you, it didn't stop until there was nothing left but dust. 3 hours later, the loud light she had predicted began to manifest, not for her, but for the hospital at large. Through the walls, she heard the first distant chime of a code blue. It was coming from the surgical recovery ward, Ward 3. Elias. Elena stood up and pressed her ear to the door. She heard the frantic scuffle of boots on the carpet, the muffled shouts of nurses, the distinctive, high-pitched whine of a defibrillator charging. The sound was a ghost of the one that had echoed in Miller's room. The system was failing in real time. She waited 10 minutes, 20. The chaos outside didn't subside, it intensified. More codes, more shouting. The sympathy reaction Sterling had likely planned for was turning into a mass casualty event. The door to her room flew open. It wasn't the nervous corporal this time. It was Silas Thorne. He was wearing his lab coat over his PT gear, and he looked like he had just run a marathon through a minefield. He was holding a set of keys and a plastic bag. We don't have much time, Silas said, his voice a low, urgent rasp. He fumbled with the soft restraints, his fingers working with a dexterity that belied his age. Elias, Elena asked as the restraints fell away. He's in the ICU, Silas said. Sterling tried to block the transfer, but the night shift supervisor overrode him when 3 other rangers from the same unit started seizing in the hallway. It's a mess, Elena. It's exactly what you said it was. The CDC is on the line, but Sterling is still trying to tell them it's a localized chemical exposure. He's delusional, Elena said, rubbing her wrists. No, he's scared, Silas countered. He's realized that if this gets out, his career isn't just over. He's looking at a war crimes tribunal for negligence. He's doubling down because he doesn't know how to do anything else. He handed her the bag. Inside was her uniform, not the blood-stained one, but a fresh set of BDUs Silas must have liberated from her locker. There was also a stethoscope and her ID card. How did you get this? She asked, pulling on the boots. Let's just say the MPs in this building like me a lot more than they like the colonel, Silas said. Now listen. The C-17 carrying the rest of the 3rd Ranger Battalion, the main body, is currently on the tarmac at Ramstein. They are refueling. They take off for Fort Benning in 90 minutes. If that plane leaves, those men are dead, and they'll take half of Georgia with them. Elena stopped, her hand frozen on the zipper of her jacket. They haven't grounded the flight? Sterling told command the illness was limited to the forward element already at Landstuhl. He convinced them it wasn't a communicable threat. He's trying to get the rest of the unit out of his theater so they are someone else's problem. Elena felt a surge of dark competence, a cold, focused energy that sharpened the world into a single point of action. I need to get to the flight line. You can't, Silas said. The MPs are looking for you. You're a fugitive now, Elena. If you step outside this annex, they'll have you in real cuffs before you hit the parking lot. Then I need to get to the ICU, Elena said. I need to prove the transmission vector. If I can show the CDC the manual smear in real time over a secure link, they'll have to override Sterling. I've already got the link set up in the lab, Silas said. But the lab is crawling with Sterling's people. He's sanitizing the data. Elena looked at Silas. This was the man who had been her anchor through 3 deployments. He was 60 years old, 3 years from retirement, with a wife in San Antonio and a collection of vintage ham radios he couldn't wait to spend his days with. By helping her, he was throwing all of it into the fire. Silas, she said, her voice soft. You don't have to do this. You can walk away. Tell them I overpowered you. Silas looked at her, his eyes sharp and clear behind his glasses. I spent 20 years watching better men than Marcus Sterling die because someone in an office was too afraid of the paperwork to tell the truth. I'm not doing it again, Elena. Not today. He handed her a small, handheld radio. Go through the oxygen manifold room. It connects to the ICU sub-basement. I'll meet you at the lab in 20 minutes. If I'm not there, it means they've locked it down. In that case, you're on your own. Elena nodded once. A shared moment of silence earned loyalty. Then she was gone, slipping out into the hallway like a shadow. The hospital had changed in the few hours she had been locked away. The quiet, professional hum had been replaced by an undercurrent of panic. She saw nurses running with boxes of PPE, their faces pale behind surgical masks. She saw a group of officers standing in a huddle near the elevators, their voices hushed and urgent. She avoided the main corridors, moving through the guts of the building. The oxygen manifold room was a labyrinth of pipes and gauges, the air smelling of ozone and cold metal. It was freezing in here, the liquid oxygen tanks venting a faint, ghostly mist that clung to the floor. She reached the sub-basement of the ICU and paused. The door was guarded. 2 MPs were stationed at the entrance to the elevator bank, their rifles slung but their postures alert. They weren't looking for a doctor, they were looking for a threat. Elena pulled her stethoscope around her neck and straightened her jacket. She took a breath, centered herself, and walked out of the shadows. Hold on, Major, one of the MPs said, stepping forward. He was older, a staff sergeant with a combat patch from the 10th Mountain. This level is restricted, orders from the Chief of Clinical Services. Elena didn't slow down. She kept her gaze fixed on the elevator buttons. I'm Major Vance, infectious disease. I was paged for the code in 4B. The colonel is waiting for the preliminary blood gas results. The MP hesitated. He saw the rank. He saw the steady, authoritative stride. He saw a woman who looked like she belonged there. Ma'am, I have a list. Sergeant, in exactly 3 minutes, the man in room 4B is going to suffer a bilateral pulmonary embolism, Elena said, her voice cold and precise. If I am not in that room to manage the heparin drip, he will die. When the inquiry asks why a ranger died on your watch, do you want your answer to be that you were checking a list? Or do you want to move out of my way? The MP looked at his partner. The second MP shrugged. In the hierarchy of the hospital, a major with a mission usually trumped a sergeant with a clipboard. Yes, ma'am, the MP said, stepping aside. Sorry, ma'am. Elena stepped into the elevator. The doors closed, and for a second she was alone in the small, moving box. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, but her hands were steady. Dark competence. It was the only thing she had left. The ICU was a war zone. The glass-walled rooms were filled with the frantic motion of medical teams. She saw Elias Vance. He was intubated now, his chest rising and falling with the mechanical rhythm of the ventilator. His skin was a waxy, translucent yellow, and even from the hallway she could see the dark, bruised black of his nail beds. He was dying, just like Miller. She moved toward the central nursing station, looking for the terminal Silas had mentioned. But before she could get there, a hand gripped her arm. Elena! She turned. It was Dr. Sarah Jenkins, a civilian pathologist from the CDC she had worked with years ago during an Ebola scare in Liberia. Sarah looked exhausted, her eyes rimmed with red. Sarah, Elena whispered, what are you doing here? I was in Berlin for a conference, Sarah said. Silas Thorne called me on an unsecure line. He said there was a Rift Valley variant breaking out in Landstuhl and that the command was suppressing the data. Elena, what the hell is happening? It's not Rift Valley, Elena said, pulling her into a small, glass-enclosed charting room. It's *Leptoplasmodium marinus*, a protozoal parasite. It mimics a viral hemorrhagic fever, but it's worse. It's highly resilient to standard antivirals, and it's spreading through the unit. I've been trying to get into the lab, Sarah said, her voice shaking. but Sterling's people are blocking me. They're saying the samples are contaminated and need to be destroyed for safety. They are not contaminated, Elena said. They are evidence. She looked through the glass at Elias. Sarah, I need you to do something for me. I need you to get to the command center. Tell the general that the CDC is officially declaring a level 4 biohazard, even if you don't have the paperwork yet. Bluff. Tell him the flight to Fort Benning has to be grounded immediately. I can't do that without a verified smear, Elena, Sarah said. The CDC doesn't work on bluffs. I need to see the shepherd's crook. Then watch the monitor, Elena said. She walked out of the charting room and straight into Elias's room. The nurses were focused on his vitals, but they didn't stop her. She was a major. She was a doctor. She looked like she knew what she was doing. She grabbed a lancet from the bedside table. With a quick, practiced motion, she pricked Elias's finger. A single drop of dark, sluggish blood bloomed on his skin. She smeared it onto a glass slide she had tucked into her pocket. Major, what are you doing? A nurse asked, finally noticing her. Verification, Elena said. She walked over to the bedside microscope, a small, portable unit used for checking cell counts. She placed the slide under the lens and adjusted the focus. There they were. The parasites weren't just present, they were thriving. They were larger than the ones she had seen in Miller's blood, their elongated bodies twisting and turning as they consumed the red blood cells. It was a massacre at a microscopic level. Sarah, look, Elena shouted. Sarah Jenkins stepped into the room and leaned over the microscope. She gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. My God, I've never seen anything like it. It's beautiful in a horrible way. It's a death sentence, Elena said. Now get to the general, go. Sarah didn't argue. She turned and ran out of the ICU, her heels clicking on the linoleum like a countdown. Elena stayed by Elias's side. She looked at his face, the face of a man who had survived combat only to be taken down by a microscopic ghost. She felt a wave of profound, bone-deep sorrow, but she pushed it down. There was no room for it yet. Major Vance. The voice was like a cold splash of water. She turned. Colonel Sterling was standing in the doorway. He wasn't alone. 4 MPs were with him, their faces grim. Sterling looked different now. The polished, arrogant facade had cracked. He looked like a man who was watching his life's work vanish into a sinkhole. You really don't know when to stop, do you? Sterling said. His voice was quiet, almost conversational. I stop when the mission is over, Colonel, Elena said. The mission is over, Sterling said, stepping into the room. You are under arrest for the theft of medical supplies, unauthorized entry into a restricted area, and the endangerment of hospital staff. MPs take her. Colonel, look at the slide, Elena said, gesturing toward the microscope. It's right there, the proof. Ground the flight and I'll go quietly. I'll sign whatever confession you want. Just save those men. Sterling didn't look. He walked over to the microscope and with a sudden, violent motion swept it off the table. It hit the floor with a sickening crash of glass and metal. The slide, the proof, shattered into 1,000 pieces. There is no slide, Sterling said, his eyes burning with a desperate, frantic light. There is only a delusional officer who has suffered a mental collapse. Take her, now. The MPs moved forward. Elena didn't resist. She let them take her arms, her gaze never leaving Sterling's face. You think you can break the world and just walk away, Marcus? She asked. The truth doesn't care about your ego. It's already out. Sarah Jenkins is talking to the general right now. Sterling's face went pale, but he didn't blink. Dr. Jenkins is a civilian guest. Her opinions carry no weight without clinical evidence, and as you just saw, the evidence is gone. He leaned in close, his breath smelling of stale coffee and fear. You're going to a high-security psychiatric facility in Landstuhl. No visitors, no phone calls. By the time anyone hears from you again, the 3rd Rangers will be in Georgia, and this will all be a footnote in a forgotten file. They dragged her out of the room. As they passed through the ICU doors, Elena saw Silas Thorne being led away in handcuffs by another group of MPs. He looked at her, his expression one of quiet, dignified defeat. He had tried. They had both tried. The institution was winning. They took her back to the sub-basement, but this time they didn't stop at the psychiatric annex. They led her toward a blacked-out transport van waiting in the loading dock. The rain was coming down in sheets now, a cold, relentless deluge that blurred the world. As they pushed her into the back of the van, Elena felt a coldness in her soul that had nothing to do with the weather. She was a doctor who couldn't heal, a soldier who couldn't protect. The van doors slammed shut, plunging her into darkness. For a long time, there was only the sound of the engine and the splash of tires on wet pavement. Elena sat on the cold metal floor, her mind spinning. She thought about the 200 Rangers. She thought about the C-17 on the tarmac at Ramstein. She thought about the shepherd's crook multiplying in the dark. And then the van stopped. It wasn't a smooth stop. It was a sudden, jarring halt that sent her sliding across the floor. She heard voices shouting, the sound of boots on gravel, and then the unmistakable asterisk, clack-clack asterisk of a weapon being chambered. The doors flew open. The light was blinding. Elena squinted, her heart racing. Standing in the rain was a man she didn't recognize at first. He was wearing a flight suit, his face smeared with grease and rain. Behind him, she could see the massive, dark silhouette of a C-17, its engines humming like a giant beast. "Major Vance?" the man asked. "Who are you?" Elena rasped. "Chief Warrant Officer 5 Miller, no relation," he said, a grim smile touching his lips. "I'm the pilot of that bird over there, and I was told you're the only person who can tell me why half my passengers are currently coughing up blood in the cargo hold." Elena felt the world tilt. The flight, it didn't take off. "The general grounded us 5 minutes ago," the pilot said. "But he didn't do it because of some CDC doctor. He did it because one of my loadmasters just collapsed and his fingers turned black right in front of me." He reached out a hand and pulled Elena out of the van. The MPs who had been guarding her were standing to the side, their hands in the air, being held at gunpoint by a team of Air Force security forces. "The colonel said you were crazy," the pilot said, looking her in the eye. "But I've seen crazy, and you just look like someone who's been waiting for the rest of us to catch up." Elena looked at the C-17. The ramp was down, and she could see the shadows of men moving inside, the 3rd Rangers, her men. "I need my kit," she said, her voice returning to its steady, clinical tone. "And I need every dose of moxictin you have on this base." "It's already on its way, Major," a voice said. Elena turned. Standing by the wing of the plane was General Holloway. He looked old, the weight of the stars on his shoulders finally seeming to take their toll. Beside him stood Sarah Jenkins and a very wet, very defiant Silas Thorne. "Major Vance," the general said, stepping forward. "I owe you an apology, and the United States Army owes you a hell of a lot more than that." "Save the apology for later, sir," Elena said. "Right now I have 200 patients who are about to have a very bad night." She turned and ran toward the plane. The rain lashed at her face, but she didn't feel the cold. She felt the mission. The dark competence was back, sharper than ever. As she stepped onto the ramp of the C-17, the smell hit her, the copper tang of blood, the sour scent of fever, and the sterile, metallic air of the aircraft. It was a smell she knew by heart. She walked into the cargo hold. The Rangers were everywhere, sitting on the floor, leaning against the walls, their faces pale in the dim red tactical lights. Some were already seizing. Others were staring at the ceiling with the same wet sand focus Miller had shown. Elena stopped in the center of the hold. She looked at the 200 men who were depending on her, and for the first time in 48 hours she felt a flicker of hope. It was small and it was quiet, but it was there. "Listen up," she shouted, her voice echoing in the cavernous space. The men who could still move turned their heads. "I'm Major Vance. I'm a doctor, and I'm going to get you home, but first we're going to have a fight." She started to move among them, her hands moving with a precision that was almost beautiful. She checked pulses, she cleared airways, she whispered words of encouragement that she didn't know she had in her. But as she reached the back of the plane, she saw something that made her heart stop. A young corporal, no more than 19, was slumped in the corner. His eyes were wide, his breathing shallow. But it wasn't the lavender cuticles that caught her eye. It was the fact that he was holding a small wooden crate, a crate that had been broken open in the chaos. And inside the crate were thousands of small, iridescent flies. They were dead now, killed by the pressurized environment of the plane, but they were there. Elena knelt down and picked one up. She looked at its wings, the way they shimmered with a sickly, bruised purple light. This wasn't a natural outbreak. She looked at the manifest attached to the crate. It wasn't a military document. It was a private contractor's label. Asterisk Ethelgard Biologicals. Asterisk the same name she had seen on the research papers Sterling had been consulting earlier that day. Elena felt a cold chill that had nothing to do with the parasite. This wasn't just a failure of intelligence or a bureaucratic cover-up. This was a field test, and she was standing in the middle of the laboratory. She looked up at the cockpit where the pilot was watching her. She looked at the general standing on the tarmac. She looked at Silas, who was already starting to unload the medical supplies. None of them knew. She reached into the crate and pulled out a small, encrypted data drive that had been hidden beneath the packing material. It was heavy, a solid block of secrets that felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. "Major, you okay?" One of the rangers asked, his voice a rasping whisper. Elena looked at the drive. She looked at the dying men around her. She knew that what she did next would decide not just her career, but the lives of everyone in that theater. She slipped the drive into her pocket. "I'm fine, Corporal," she said, her voice like steel. "Just getting started." The decision was made. She wouldn't tell the general, not yet. She wouldn't tell Sarah Jenkins. The system had already proven it couldn't be trusted with the truth. She would keep the drive. She would find out who Ethelgard was, and she would burn them to the ground. But first she had to save her soldiers. She turned back to the medical supplies and began to bark orders. The nurses who had followed her onto the plane moved with frantic energy. The air was filled with the sound of tearing plastic, the hiss of oxygen, and the low, steady rhythm of Elena's voice. Hours passed. The sun began to rise over the German countryside, casting a pale, watery light over the flight line. The C-17 had become a floating hospital, a sanctuary of blood and hope. Elena was leaning against a stack of crates, her eyes burning with exhaustion when her radio crackled to life. "Major Vance, this is command. We have a situation at the main gate." Elena frowned. "What kind of situation?" "It's Colonel Sterling, ma'am. He's not alone. He has a team with him. They're claiming they have a direct order from the Department of Defense to take custody of the experimental assets on the aircraft." Elena's hand tightened on the radio. Experimental assets. They weren't talking about the flies. They were talking about the men. "What's the general's position?" Elena asked. "The general is being detained by a JAG team from Userer. They're saying he's being relieved for gross negligence and violation of quarantine protocols." Elena looked at the 200 Rangers. They were starting to stabilize. The loading doses of moxide were working. The shepherd's crook was being driven back. But now a different kind of parasite was coming for them. "Tell the gate to hold them," Elena said. "We can't, ma'am. They have a signed order from the Secretary of Defense." Elena looked at the pilot, who was standing in the doorway of the cockpit. He had heard the radio call. He looked at her, his expression one of grim realization. "If they get on this plane, Major, these guys aren't going to a hospital," the pilot said. "They're going to a black site." Elena stood up. Her body was screaming for sleep, but her mind was a cold, calculating machine. She looked at the data drive in her pocket. She looked at the 200 men who had bled for a country that was now coming to treat them like property. "Can you fly this thing?" she asked the pilot. The pilot blinked. "What? Can you take off right now?" "Major, I don't have a flight plan. I don't have clearance. If I put this bird in the air without authorization, they'll have F-16s on our tail before we clear the border." "Then fly low," Elena said. "Fly where they can't see us. Take us to the only place they can't touch us." "And where the hell is that?" Elena looked at Silas Thorne, who was standing at the edge of the ramp. He nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. "The only place where the truth still matters," Elena said. "Home." The pilot looked at the men in the cargo hold. He looked at Elena. He saw the fire in her eyes, the dark competence of a woman who had already lost everything and had nothing left to fear. "Secure the ramp," he said, turning back toward the cockpit. "And tell those Rangers to buckle up. It's going to be a bumpy ride." Elena ran to the ramp. "Silas, get on now." Silas didn't hesitate. He hopped onto the moving ramp just as it began to lift. The MPs at the edge of the tarmac were shouting, their weapons drawn, but they didn't fire. They were confused, caught between their orders and the sheer audacity of what was happening. The engines of the C-17 roared to life, a deafening, chest-rattling scream. The massive plane began to taxi, ignoring the frantic signals from the control tower. Elena stood in the center of the cargo hold, her legs braced against the vibration. She looked at the men, many of whom were still unconscious, unaware that they were now part of a mutiny. She felt the moment the nose of the plane lifted off the ground. The sudden G-force pressed her into the wall, but she didn't look away from the window. As the C-17 climbed into the gray, rainy sky, Elena saw a line of black subs screaming across the tarmac toward the spot where they had just been. She reached into her pocket and felt the data drive. She didn't know where they were going. She didn't know how they were going to land. She didn't know if they would even make it across the Atlantic. But as the plane leveled out and the roar of the engines settled into a steady hum, Elena Vance sat down on the floor next to Elias Vance and took his hand. "We're going home, Elias," she whispered. But even as she said it, she knew the truth. The battle wasn't over. It had just moved to a different front. And this time she wasn't just fighting a parasite. She was fighting the people who had created it. The C-17 banked hard to the west, disappearing into the thick protective layer of the clouds. Behind them, the world they knew was falling away, replaced by a cold, dangerous uncertainty. Elena closed her eyes, and for the first time in 3 days, she slept. She didn't dream of the hospital. She didn't dream of the blood. She dreamed of the desert in Marfa. She dreamed of the silence. And she dreamed of the storm that was coming, a storm that she was now leading straight into the heart of the machine. 3 hours into the flight, the radio crackled. It wasn't the pilot. It was a voice Elena didn't recognize, a cold, synthesized voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Major Vance, we know you have the drive, we know where you are, and we know who you love." Elena opened her eyes. The cargo hold was quiet, the only sound the steady breathing of the Rangers. She looked at the radio. "You have 6 hours to surrender the asset, or we will initiate the secondary protocol." Elena stood up. She walked to the cockpit and looked out at the endless expanse of the Atlantic. "What is the secondary protocol?" she asked into the radio. There was a long pause, and then the voice returned, its tone devoid of all human emotion. "The secondary protocol, Major, is the reason the flies were in the crate." Elena felt the blood drain from her face. She turned and looked back at the cargo hold, and that was when she saw it. A small, iridescent fly, shimmering with a sickly purple light, was crawling across the glass of the cockpit door. It wasn't dead, and it wasn't alone. The first fly didn't buzz. It simply drifted through the pressurized air of the C-17's cockpit like a piece of purple lint, landing on the glass of the flight instrument panel with a soft, wet click that sounded like a hammer hitting a primer. Elena Vance watched it through the narrow gap of the cockpit door, her pulse jumping in her neck, a single beat of pure, crystalline terror that she immediately smoothed over with the practiced ice of her training. The secondary protocol wasn't a threat of a missile lock or a remote self-destruct sequence. It was the realization that the containment she thought she had secured on the tarmac was an illusion. The aircraft was not a lifeboat. It was an incubator. She didn't scream. She didn't call out to the pilot. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a clear plastic specimen bag she'd liberated from the Landstuhl supply cabinet, and moved with the slow, agonizing deliberateness of a bomb technician. The fly was iridescent, its wings a bruised, oily violet, its body pulsating with a rhythmic, unnatural vigor. It shouldn't have been alive in the cold, thin air of a pressurized cabin at 28,000 feet. It should have been dormant, chilled into submission by the aircraft's environmental control system. But as she snapped the bag over the insect, it didn't struggle. It turned its multifaceted eyes toward her, and Elena felt a sickening jolt of recognition. This wasn't a random mutation. This was a programmed behavior. She turned back to the cargo hold, where 200 Rangers were strapped into red nylon jump seats, their heads lolling, their breathing a discordant symphony of rails and wheezes. Silas Thorne was at the far end of the hold, adjusting a portable oxygen concentrator for a sergeant whose fingernails had turned the color of a winter plum. Silas looked up, his glasses reflecting the harsh, red tactical lights of the cabin, and saw the look on Elena's face. He didn't need to ask. He saw the specimen bag in her hand. He saw the purple smudge of the insect. He stood up, his old joints popping, and began to move toward her, his face a mask of weary, professional focus. The secondary protocol is the hatch, Elena realized, her mind racing through the biological architecture of the asterisk leptoplasmodium asterisk. The parasite didn't just want to kill the host, it wanted to leave. It used the cytokine storm she'd observed in Miller and Elias to create a thermal signature that triggered the flies to seek out the heat. The flies were the taxis, the Rangers were the fuel, and the aircraft was the distribution system. If they landed anywhere, Ramstein, Lades, or the United States, the moment the ramp dropped, the protocol would complete. 200 men would become the epicenter of a continental extinction event. Elena stepped back into the cargo hold and slammed the cockpit door shut, locking it from the outside. Chief Warrant Officer Miller's muffled voice came through the intercom, demanding to know what was happening, but she ignored him. She had to isolate the flight deck. If the pilot went down, the plane went down. She looked at Silas. "We have a breach," she said, her voice a low, steady hum that cut through the roar of the 4 Pratt and Whitney engines. "The larvae aren't in the crates, Silas, they are in the men." Silas stopped 3 feet from her. He looked at the Ranger nearest to him, a corporal named Henderson, whose neck was swollen with inflamed lymph nodes. "Where?" "Subcutaneous. Triggered by the inflammatory response," Elena said. She moved to Henderson, her hands moving with a dark, terrifying competence. She didn't use a local anesthetic. There wasn't time. She took a scalpel and made a shallow, 1-inch incision over the corporal's collarbone. Henderson didn't flinch. He was too far gone, his consciousness drifting in the gray space of the parasite's neurotoxic fog. As the blade parted the skin, Elena didn't see blood. She saw a thick, translucent gel, and within it, a dozen tiny, violet-winged shapes shivering as they were exposed to the air. They were waiting for the fever to reach its peak. They were waiting for the host to die so they could feast on the remains and carry the next generation to the next victim. Tape, Elena barked. Silas was already there, handing her a roll of heavy-duty duct tape. She covered the incision, sealing the larvae inside the man's body. She looked down the long, dim tunnel of the cargo hold, 200 men. Each one was a ticking biological bomb. Each one had thousands of these things beneath their skin, waiting for the secondary protocol to reach its terminal phase. "The radio," Silas whispered, looking at the speaker where the synthesized voice had just spoken. "Ethelgard, they aren't just watching us. They're timing us. They're waiting for the fever to break the blood-brain barrier," Elena said, her mind narrowing to a single, cold point of logic. "Once the brain liquefies, the thermal spike will trigger a mass emergence. We have maybe 4 hours before this plane becomes a cloud of purple wings." She looked at her hands. They were shaking, just a fraction of a millimeter. She clenched them into fists, forcing the adrenaline back into the cage of her ribs. She was a major in the United States Army. She was a doctor, she was a fugitive, and she was the only thing standing between a laboratory-grade plague and the rest of the world. "We need to drop the cabin temperature," Elena said. "Now." She grabbed the intercom handset. "Miller, this is Vance. Listen to me very carefully. I need you to kill the heat in the cargo hold. I want it as cold as you can get it without freezing the hydraulics. We need to put these men and what's inside them into stasis." "Major, it's already 40 degrees back there," Miller's voice crackled, sounding strained. "If I drop it any lower, we're going to start seeing hypothermia in the wounded." "The hypothermia will kill them slower than the protocol will," Elena snapped. "Do it. And Miller, if you see anything fly past your head, you put on your oxygen mask and you don't take it off until we're on the ground. Do you understand?" There was a pause, a long, heavy silence where the only sound was the rush of the Atlantic wind against the hull. "Copy that, Doc," dropping the temp. "God help you back there." A moment later, the low hum of the environmental system shifted into a high-pitched whine. The air in the hold began to turn brittle. Elena could see her breath in the red light, a ghostly plume of white that vanished into the shadows. The Rangers began to shiver, a reflexive primal response that Elena watched with clinical detachment. The shivering was good. It meant their nervous systems were still fighting. But it wouldn't be enough. She turned to the first row of seats. "Silas, get the mock psyched in. We can't wait for the Roman 4 drips to finish. We need to bolus them. We have to kill the parasite before it triggers the emergence, even if the toxicity levels are off the charts." "Elena, a bolus at this concentration. You'll stop their hearts," Silas said, his voice cracking for the first time. "You're talking about a 50% mortality rate. If we do nothing, the mortality rate is 100% for them and millions of others," Elena said. She looked at Elias, who was strapped into a litter near the bulkhead. His chest was barely moving. "I'm not asking for a consensus, Silas. I'm giving an order. Help me or get out of the way." Silas looked at her for a long second, seeing the woman he had known for a decade, the woman who had once spent 48 hours straight sewing the intestines of a child back together in a dirt-floor clinic in Helmand. He saw the cost of her certainty in the lines around her eyes, the way her shoulders were braced against the weight of the world. He nodded once, reached into the medical kit, and pulled out a handful of pre-filled syringes. They began at the front. It was a grueling mechanical process. Elena moved from man to man, her fingers finding the jugular or the femoral artery with a speed that was almost supernatural. She didn't look at their faces. She didn't look at the names on their BDUs. She focused on the needle, the resistance of the skin, the plunge of the medication. Each injection was a gamble. Each one was a possible execution. 20 men, 30, 40. The cargo hold became a landscape of gasping breath and the smell of ozone. The temperature continued to drop. Elena's fingers began to lose their feeling, the cold biting through her thin latex gloves, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. She felt the dark competence she had cultivated over a lifetime narrowing her vision until the world was nothing but a series of injection sites. At man number 64, the first heart stopped. It was the 19-year-old corporal, the one who had been carrying the crate. He let out a soft, rattling sigh and his head fell forward. Elena didn't hesitate. She dropped to her knees, her hands finding the center of his chest. Asterisk 1, 2, 3, 4. Asterisk the rhythm of CPR echoed against the roar of the engines. Silas watched her, his own hands busy with an Roman 4 line, but he didn't offer to take over. He knew Elena. He knew she wouldn't stop until the ribs cracked or the heart restarted. "Come on, you kid," she whispered, her voice a harsh rasp. "Not here, not like this." She felt the ribs give way, a sickening wet snap. She didn't flinch. She kept pressing. She was pouring her own life force into the boy, her teeth clenched so hard they felt like they might shatter. Asterisk 1, 2, 3, 4. Asterisk after 3 minutes, the corporal's chest jerked. He coughed, a spray of dark, parasite-laden fluid hitting Elena's face. She didn't wipe it off. She checked his pulse, thready, erratic, but there. "Keep him cold," she told Silas, standing up and moving to the next man. The cost was mounting. Her back felt like it was being flayed by a hot iron. Her eyes were stinging from the sweat and the cold, but she moved on. She was a machine made of bone and will, a ghost in a flight suit. 2 hours in, they reached the midpoint of the hold. The temperature was now 32 degrees. The metal walls of the C-17 were coated in a fine layer of frost. The Rangers were silent now, their bodies in a state of medically induced and environmentally forced hibernation. Elena stopped for a moment, leaning against a pallet of MREs. She looked at her hands. They were covered in a mixture of blood, sweat, and the purple gel of the larvae. She looked like something that had crawled out of a nightmare. "You need to breathe, Elena," Silas said, stepping beside her. He handed her a bottle of water. It was slushy with ice. She took a sip, the cold water hitting her stomach like a punch. "How many?" "We've lost 6, Silas said quietly. "Their systems couldn't take the bolus, but the others. Their fevers are dropping. The emergence is stalling." "It's not enough," Elena said, looking at the ceiling vents. She could see more of the purple flies now, dozens of them clinging to the grates, their wings vibrating in a low, subsonic frequency that she could feel in her teeth. "They're waiting for the pressure to change. The moment we start our descent, the change in atmospheric pressure will trigger the hatch regardless of the temperature." "Then we don't descend," Silas said. "We have to," Elena countered. "We're running out of fuel. Miller says we have maybe 3 hours of flight time left. We're in the middle of the Atlantic, Silas. There's nowhere to go but down." She looked at the radio speaker. Ethelgard was quiet now. They were waiting. They knew the physics of the flight better than she did. They knew that gravity was their silent partner. "Major Vance." The voice wasn't the synthesized one. It was Miller over the intercom. His voice was trembling. "Vance, I think I'm seeing things." Elena hit the intercom button. "Miller, report. There's a light off the port wing. It's not a star and it's not another bird. It's a drone, Major. A big one. It's been sitting on our wing for 10 minutes, matching our speed exactly." Elena moved to the small, thick window of the cargo door. She peered out into the darkness. There, sitting just past the wingtip, was a sleek, windowless shape. Its navigation lights a cold, mocking blue. It was an MQ-9 Reaper, but it didn't have the markings of the U.S. Air Force. "Ethelgard," she whispered. "They're going to shoot us down," Silas said, stepping up behind her. "No," Elena said, her mind working through the variables. "If they shoot us down over the ocean, the parasite dies in the salt water. They don't want us dead. They want us to land, but they want to make sure we land where they want us." The radio crackled to life again. The synthesized voice was back. "Major Vance, you have reached the point of no return. You will change your heading to 142 degrees. You will descend to 10,000 feet. You will prepare for landing at the following coordinates." A series of numbers followed. Elena didn't need a map to know where they led. A private airstrip in the Azores. A place where a C-17 could land and be swallowed by a hangar before anyone knew it was there. A place where the assets could be harvested in private. "Miller, don't touch those controls," Elena shouted into the intercom. "Major, the drone just painted us with a targeting laser," Miller yelled back. "They're giving me 10 seconds to bank left, or they're going to take out our number 4 engine." "Let them," Elena said. "Are you crazy? If we lose an engine over the drink?" "If we turn, everyone on this plane is a lab rat," Elena said. "Miller, listen to me. I know you're scared. I'm scared. But you're a chief warrant officer in the United States Army. You didn't join to be a delivery boy for a pharmaceutical company. Hold your course." 10 seconds passed. The aircraft suddenly jolted, a massive, bone-shaking shudder that sent Elena and Silas crashing to the floor. The roar of the engines changed, the steady hum replaced by a screaming, metal-on-metal screech. "Engine 4 is gone," Miller shouted. "Fire in the housing. I'm cutting the fuel line." The plane began to bank, the weight of the dead engine pulling them toward the dark water below. Elena scrambled to her feet, her fingers clawing at the cargo netting. She looked at the Rangers. They were sliding in their seats, their bodies straining against the harnesses. "Silas, check the litters." She fought her way to the cockpit door and punched in the override code. The door hissed open, and she was hit by a wall of heat. The cockpit was a chaos of flashing red lights and warning klaxons. Miller was fighting the yoke, his muscles bulging under his flight suit. His co-pilot, a young lieutenant she hadn't spoken to, was frantically flipping switches on the overhead panel. "I can't hold her level," Miller yelled. "The drone is coming back for another pass." Elena looked out the front canopy. The Reaper was banking, its sleek body silhouetted against the rising moon. It was coming around for the kill. "Can you dive?" Elena asked. "What dive? If you drop the nose, can you outrun the targeting laser?" "This is a C-17, Vance, not an F-22. If I dive at this altitude, the wings will rip off." "Then rip them off," Elena shouted. "Because if you don't, we're dead anyway." Miller looked at her, his eyes wide and bloodshot. He saw the purple gel on her face. He saw the absolute, terrifying certainty in her gaze. He didn't ask another question. He grabbed the yoke with both hands and pushed. The floor dropped out from under Elena's feet. The C-17 groaned, a sound of tortured metal that seemed to come from the very soul of the aircraft. The nose pitched down, and the world became a vertical blur of dark clouds and white-capped waves. The airspeed indicator began to climb, 350 knots, 400, 450. The airframe began to vibrate so violently that Elena felt like her teeth were being shaken loose from her skull. In the cargo hold, the screams of the Rangers began to join the roar of the wind. They were awake now, the sudden change in G-force and pressure jolting their nervous systems back to life. Elena pulled herself into the jump seat behind Miller and buckled in. She watched the altimeter, 20,000 feet, 15, 10. "The drone is still on us," the lieutenant shouted. "It's diving with us." "Go lower," Elena yelled. "We're at 5,000. I have to pull up or we're going to hit the drink." "Not yet." At 3,000 feet, the ocean was a terrifying, hungry presence below them. Elena could see the white spray of the waves. She could see the dark, cold depths waiting to swallow them. "Now," she screamed. Miller pulled back on the yoke with everything he had. The C-17 leveled out with a force that felt like a physical blow. Elena's vision went black for a second, the blood being forced out of her brain by the sheer magnitude of the pull-up. When her vision cleared, they were skimming the surface of the water, no more than 500 feet above the waves. The Reaper drone, unable to match the sudden, violent maneuver at such low altitude, had overshot them. It was pulling up, its sensors struggling to require the target against the clutter of the sea spray. "Did we lose it?" Miller gasped, his breath coming in ragged hitches. "For now," Elena said. She looked at the radar. The blue dot of the drone was circling 3 miles behind them. "But they'll be back, and we're trailing smoke." She unbuckled and stood up, her legs feeling like water. She walked back into the cargo hold. The scene was a nightmare. The sudden dive and pull-up had shattered the fragile stability she had created. The drop in pressure had triggered the emergence. The air in the hold was thick with purple wings. Thousands of the flies were swarming, their buzzing a deafening, rhythmic drone that drowned out the engines. They were landing on the Rangers, their needle-like proboscises searching for a way through the cold, stiffened skin. Silas was in the middle of it, a plastic sheet pulled over his head, swatting at the insects with a clipboard. He looked at Elena, his eyes wide with horror. "They are out, Elena, the protocol. It's happening." Elena didn't hesitate. She grabbed a canister of industrial-strength disinfectant from the emergency locker. "Silas, get to the back, use the fire extinguishers, we have to knock them down." She began to spray the air, the harsh chemicals creating a mist that made the flies falter. But there were too many. For everyone she killed, 10 more seemed to emerge from the shadows of the cargo netting. She moved to Elias. He was awake, his eyes darting around the hold in a frantic, confused panic. A dozen of the flies were crawling over his face, their wings vibrating against his skin. "Elias, stay still," Elena shouted, her voice breaking. She swiped the flies away with her bare hand, feeling their cold, oily bodies crush beneath her fingers. She grabbed a roll of medical gauze and began to wrap his head, creating a makeshift cocoon. "Elena," Elias whispered, his voice a ghost of the man she knew. What are they?" "They're nothing," she said, her heart breaking as she saw a fly disappear into his ear canal. "They're nothing, Elias, just hold on, we're almost there." She knew it was a lie. They weren't almost anywhere. They were in a crippled plane over a dark ocean, surrounded by a biological weapon that was slowly consuming them. The cost was no longer just her career or her standing. It was the man she had spent her life trying to protect. She stood up, her jaw set, her eyes burning with a dark, terrifying light. She wasn't just a doctor anymore. She was a hunter. She grabbed a portable oxygen tank and a flare gun from the survival kit. "Silas, Miller, listen to me," she shouted into the intercom. "We're going to depressurize the hold. Major, you'll kill everyone back there," Miller yelled. "No, we're at 300 feet. There's enough oxygen, but the sudden change in pressure will suck the flies out through the vents. It's the only way to clear the hold. If you open those vents, the drag will rip the tail off. Then hold the damn plane together." Elena screamed. She didn't wait for an answer. She moved to the emergency pressure release valve near the rear ramp. She looked at Silas, who was huddled near the bulkhead. "Hold on to something," she yelled. She grabbed the handle and pulled. The sound was like a bomb going off. The air in the hold was sucked toward the rear of the plane with a violent, terrifying force. Elena was nearly pulled off her feet, her hands gripping the steel rail of the jump seat until her knuckles turned white. The purple swarm was caught in the vortex. Thousands of the flies were dragged toward the vents, their tiny bodies shredded by the sheer force of the airflow. They were spat out into the Atlantic night, a cloud of iridescent dust that vanished into the wake of the engines. For 30 seconds, the hold was a hurricane of noise and debris. Equipment was flying, blankets were being ripped from the Rangers, and the plane was bucking like a wild animal. And then it was over. Elena slammed the valve shut. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the ragged breathing of the survivors and the distant groan of the damaged engine. The flies were gone. The hold was empty of the purple swarm, the only remnants being the crushed bodies littering the floor and the faint, bruised smell of the parasite. Elena slumped against the wall, her chest heaving. She looked at Silas. He was still alive, his face pale, his hands shaking as he gripped the cargo netting. She looked at the Rangers. They were battered, cold, and terrified, but they were still breathing. She had done it. She had broken the protocol, but the victory was short-lived. "Major Vance," Miller's voice was hollow. "Major, you need to come to the cockpit. Now." Elena pulled herself up and stumbled toward the front of the plane. She felt like she was moving through molasses, her body finally beginning to realize the toll she had taken on it. She stepped into the cockpit and looked out the canopy. The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, a thin sliver of orange and gold that illuminated the world. And there, standing between them and the coast of America, was a fleet of ships. Not U.S. Navy ships. They were unmarked, sleek, and high-tech, their decks bristling with anti-aircraft batteries and drone launch pads. And in the center of the fleet was a massive, floating platform, a mobile laboratory, its lights glowing with a cold, clinical blue. "Ethelgard," Elena whispered. "They've been waiting for us," Miller said, his voice flat. "They knew we'd head for the coast. They've blocked every flight path." Elena looked at the radar. The Reaper drone was back, joined by 3 others. They were circling the C-17, a pack of wolves waiting for the kill. The radio crackled one last time. "Major Vance, you have been a most resilient variable, but the experiment requires the data. You will land on the platform or you will be neutralized. You have 60 seconds to comply." Elena looked at the fleet. She looked at the broken, bleeding men in her cargo hold. She looked at the data drive in her pocket. The cost was finally here. The reckoning she had been running from since Landstuhl. She knew what she had to do. "Miller," she said, her voice quiet and steady, "do we have any fuel left in the auxiliary tanks? Maybe 10 minutes worth. Why? I want you to head for that platform, full throttle." "Vance, that's suicide. They'll blow us out of the sky." "No, they won't," Elena said. She pulled the data drive from her pocket and held it up. "Because they know I have the only copy of the sequencing data. They won't risk destroying it." She looked at the pilot, a man she had met only hours ago, a man who had risked everything to help her. "Miller, when we get close, I want you to drop the ramp." "What for?" "I'm going to give them what they want," Elena said. She turned and walked back into the cargo hold. She found Silas, who was busy tending to the corporal she had brought back from the dead. "Silas," she said, placing a hand on his shoulder. He looked up, and for the first time in 10 years, he saw the girl she had been before the wars, before the labs, before the weight of the stars had crushed the life out of her. "Elena, don't," he whispered. "I have to, Silas. It's the only way they'll let the plane go." She reached into her medical kit and pulled out a small glass vial. It was the concentrated sample of the parasite she had taken from Elias. "Tell them the truth, Silas," she said. "Tell everyone. Don't let them bury this." She turned and walked toward the rear of the plane. The C-17 was screaming now, its engines pushed to their absolute limit. The fleet was looming large in the window, a wall of steel and shadow. The ramp began to drop. The wind hit Elena like a physical blow, a freezing, salt-laden blast that nearly sent her over the edge. She stood on the edge of the ramp, her flight suit whipping around her, the data drive in one hand and the vial in the other. She looked down at the platform. She could see the men in white suits waiting for her. She could see the cameras, the sensors, the cold, calculating eyes of the machine. She looked back at the cargo hold one last time. Elias was looking at her. He couldn't speak, he couldn't move, but he was looking at her. And in his eyes, she saw the only thing that mattered, recognition. She smiled, a small, sad movement of her lips, and then she stepped off the ramp. The fall was a blur of gray sky and blue water. For a second, Elena felt like she was flying, the weight of the world finally lifted from her shoulders. She felt the wind in her hair, the sun on her face, and the cold, pure clarity of the mission. She didn't scream. She didn't pray. She watched the C-17 as it roared over the platform, its wings straining, its engines spitting fire. She watched as it cleared the fleet and headed toward the horizon, toward the safety of the American coast. And then she hit the water. The cold was absolute. It was a crushing, bone-shattering weight that drove the air from her lungs and the light from her eyes. She felt the data drive slip from her fingers, vanishing into the dark, silent depths of the Atlantic. She felt the vial shatter against her chest, the parasite finally finding its way into the only host it had ever truly wanted. Herself. Elena Vance sank into the darkness, the silence of the ocean swallowing her whole. But as the light faded, she felt a strange sense of peace. She was the index now. She was the archive, and as long as she stayed in the dark, the truth would stay with her. The C-17 disappeared into the clouds, a lone, broken bird flying toward a home that would never be the same. On the platform, the men in white suits waited, their sensors searching the water for the woman who had defied them. But the ocean was empty. The only thing left was the wind, the waves, and the memory of a woman who had chosen to be right in a world that only wanted her to be silent. Hours later, the sun fully rose over the Atlantic, casting its golden light over the spot where the Major had vanished. The fleet was gone. The platform was a distant speck on the horizon. The ocean was calm, its surface a mirror of the sky. And deep below in the cold, silent dark, a single purple-winged fly drifted through the water, its life force slowly fading as the salt took its toll. The mission was over. But the war was just beginning. Silas Thorne sat on the floor of the C-17, his hand on Elias's shoulder, his eyes fixed on the empty space where the ramp had been. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper. It was the note Elena had slipped into his hand before she stepped off the ramp. On it were 5 words, written in the steady, clinical hand of a world-class doctor, *, find the others. Don't stop. * Silas looked at the paper for a long time. Then he folded it carefully and tucked it into his wallet. He looked at the Rangers, who were finally beginning to wake up, their eyes clear for the first time in days. He looked at the pilot, who was turning the plane toward the nearest military base, his face set in a mask of grim determination. The system had failed them. The institution had betrayed them. But they were still standing. And as long as they were standing, the truth would have a voice. The C-17 crossed the coastline of Virginia as the first lights of the cities began to twinkle in the dusk. It was a quiet landing. There were no medals. There were no ceremonies. There were only the MPs, the ambulances, and the long, cold silence of the hangar. But as the Rangers were carried off the plane, each one of them stopped for a moment and looked at the empty ramp. They didn't know her name. They didn't know where she had gone. But they knew they were alive because of her. And in the silence of the hangar, that was enough. The story of Major Elena Vance would never be written in the official files. It would never be told in the halls of the Pentagon. It would live in the whispered conversations of the men she saved. It would live in the data Silas Thorne would spend the rest of his life uncovering. And it would live in the cold, dark depths of the Atlantic, where the most extraordinary capability of all, the power to say no, was finally at rest. The reckoning was coming. The world would eventually find out what Ethelgard had done. The truth would find its way into the light, as it always did. But for now, there was only the rain, the silence, and the memory of a woman who had given everything for a mission that no one would ever know. The immediate aftermath was a blur of questions, blood tests, and isolation rooms. But through it all, Silas kept his hand on the note. * find the others. * he knew what it meant. Elena hadn't been the only one. And as he looked out the window of his isolation cell at the flickering lights of the American night, Silas Thorne made a promise to the woman he had lost. He wouldn't stop. Not until the last fly was dead. Not until the last secret was told. Not until Elena Vance came home. The story was far from over. It was just shifting its shape, moving from the air and the sea into the shadows and the boardrooms. But the heart of it remained the same. One woman, one mission, one truth, and a cost that would be paid for generations to come. The styrofoam cup was 3/4 full of lukewarm, bitter coffee when the heavy steel door of Interrogation Room B at Fort Detrick clicked open at 03:42 on a Tuesday morning. Silas Thorne didn't look up. He didn't need to see the 4-star brass on General Raymond Sterling's shoulders or the clinical coldness in the eyes of the 2 CID investigators to know that the world he had inhabited for 30 years had finally finished its collapse. The room smelled of ozone and industrial floor wax, a scent Silas would forever associate with the death of integrity. He sat perfectly still, his hands folded on the laminate table, watching a single bead of condensation track down the side of the cup like a slow-motion tear. He was thinking about the way the wind had sounded when the ramp of the C-17 dropped over the Atlantic, a hollow, hungry roar that had swallowed the only woman who had ever seen the truth clearly. General Sterling didn't sit. He walked to the far corner of the room, his polished jump boots squeaking on the linoleum, and stared at the one-way mirror. He looked older than he had 48 hours ago at Landstuhl. The skin beneath his eyes was the color of a bruised plum, and his uniform, usually crisp enough to cut glass, looked heavy, as if the weight of the last 2 days was physically pulling at the fabric. He was a man who had spent his life believing in the chain of command as a sacred geometry, and Elena Vance had just shattered every angle of it. "The recovery teams have been on site for 36 hours, Silas," Sterling said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that sounded like it had been dragged through gravel. "They've searched 200 square miles of the Atlantic. They found a piece of the C-17's tail assembly. They found some floating debris from the medical crates. They found nothing else." Silas finally looked up. His glasses were smudged and his eyes were bloodshot from 60 hours without sleep, but his gaze was steady. "She isn't a piece of debris, General. She was the mission, and you're the one who sent her out there without a parachute." One of the CID investigators, a man named Miller who looked like he'd been carved out of a block of salt, stepped forward, his hand resting on a thick, black-bindered report. "Let's keep it professional, Colonel Thorne. We're here to establish a timeline of the Major's mental state leading up to the incident. There are questions about the validity of her findings at Landstuhl. Questions about whether the emergency on the flight was as catastrophic as she reported." "The emergency," Silas said, the words tasting like copper in his mouth, "involved a laboratory-grade biological weapon emerging from the chests of 200 Army Rangers. I have 64 survivors in the isolation wing downstairs who can testify to the validity of her findings, provided your people haven't drugged them into a coma yet." Sterling turned around, his face hardening into the mask of the career officer. "The Rangers are under a level 5 quarantine, Silas. You know the protocol. This isn't a conspiracy, it's a containment. What Vance did, jumping with the data, destroying the samples, it's being looked at as a terminal act of professional negligence, or worse." "Or worse," Silas laughed, a dry, hacking sound. "She saved the East Coast. If those flies had reached the tarmac at Dover, we wouldn't be having this conversation. We'd be burning bodies in the streets of D.C. She knew that. She knew you wouldn't listen. She knew Ethelgard had their hooks in the Pentagon. So she did the only thing a soldier could do. She took the target with her. Ethelgard is a registered government contractor with a clean audit trail," Miller snapped. "This fixation the Major had with a shadow entity is exactly what we're looking at. We need to know if she was experiencing a dissociative episode. We need to know if she had a history of paranoia." Silas leaned forward, the styrofoam cup crinkling under the sudden pressure of his hand. "You have the flight recorder, don't you? You heard her. You heard her tell Miller to hold the course while a Reaper drone painted them with a targeting laser. Was the drone a dissociative episode? Was the fire an engine for a hallucination?" Sterling's jaw tightened. He looked away, his gaze drifting back to the mirror. The silence in the room became heavy, the kind of silence that exists in a room right after a judge reads a sentence. For 3 minutes, the only sound was the hum of the HVAC system and the distant, rhythmic thud of a door closing somewhere in the bowels of the facility. "The flight recorder is classified," Sterling said finally, "as is the drone's origin. We are looking into a potential breach of the MQ-9 command and control uplink. It may have been a foreign actor. "It was us," Silas whispered. "It was us trying to kill our own people to protect a balance sheet, and Elena was the only one with the balls to stand in the way." Sterling didn't argue. He didn't defend the institution. He just stood there, a man whose silence cost more than any words he could have spoken. In that silence, Silas saw the reckoning. He saw the moment the general had listened to the audio from the cockpit. He had heard Elena's voice, not screaming, not pleading, but cold and surgical as she gave the order to dive. He had heard her say, "Let them," when the drone threatened to fire. Sterling knew. He knew he had been wrong at Landstuhl. He knew he had been the one to sign the orders that pushed her off that ramp. And the knowledge was eating him alive. The personal cost was arriving now, settling into the room like a fog. Silas felt it in the ache of his joints, in the way the memory of Elena's small, sad smile on the ramp kept looping in his mind. She hadn't just saved the Rangers, she had saved Silas. She had shoved him into the shadows of the cargo hold, protected him from the draft, and then vanished into the blue. She was 32 years old. She liked her coffee black and her books old, and she had spent 10 years of her life in the dirt of foreign countries patching up boys who didn't know why they were there. And now the army she had served was trying to erase her before her body was even cold. "You're being reassigned, Silas," Sterling said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Effective immediately. You're headed to a desk at the VA in Cheyenne, Wyoming. Your security clearance is being dropped to secret. You will not speak to the media. You will not contact the families of the Rangers. You will sign a non-disclosure agreement before you leave this building, or you will be court-martialed for the unauthorized bolus injections you administered on that flight." "Wyoming," Silas said. "The end of the world." "It's a quiet place," Sterling said. "You should appreciate the quiet." "You're burying me," Silas said. "Just like you're burying her." "I'm keeping you alive," Sterling countered, and for a split second the mask slipped. There was a flash of genuine, visceral fear in the general's eyes. It wasn't fear of Silas or fear of the truth. It was the fear of a man who realized he was no longer the one in control of the machinery he had spent 40 years building. He was a cog, and the cog was being turned by a hand he couldn't see. Miller stood up and pushed a single sheet of paper across the table. A pen followed. "Sign it, Colonel, for your own sake. The Major is gone. Don't make her sacrifice a total waste by following her into the dark." Silas looked at the paper. It was a standard NDA, filled with the dense, suffocating legalese of the Department of Defense. It was the sound of a lid closing on a coffin. He picked up the pen. His hand didn't shake. He thought of Elena on the ramp. Asterisk, find the others. Don't stop. Asterisk, he signed his name, not because he was afraid, but because he knew that if he went to Leavenworth, the truth would die with him. If he went to Wyoming, he would be a ghost. And ghosts are hard to catch. The institutional machinery moved with a terrifying, silent efficiency. Within 2 hours, Silas was escorted out of Fort Detrick. He wasn't allowed to go back to his quarters. His personal effects would be shipped to him. He was put into the back of a black Chevy Suburban with tinted windows and driven toward Dulles. As the vehicle moved through the pre-dawn streets of Maryland, Silas watched the world go by. People were jogging. People were stopping at Starbucks. The sun was coming up over the Chesapeake, a pale, watery yellow that promised nothing. None of them knew. None of them would ever know how close they had come to the end of everything. They were safe because a woman they didn't know had decided that the mission mattered more than her life. He thought of the Rangers back at Detrick. He thought of Elias, whose face had been the last thing Elena saw. Silas knew the institutional response wouldn't stop at NDAs and reassignments. They would start the reconstruction of the event. The purple flies would become a rare, altitude-induced fungal infection. The drone would become a training exercise gone wrong. Elena's jump would be framed as a suicide, the tragic end of an overstressed officer who couldn't handle the pressure of the field. They would give her a quiet burial in Arlington, a small stone with a name and a rank, and they would wait for the world to forget. But the institution had forgotten one thing. They had forgotten that Silas Thorne wasn't just a doctor. He was a witness. When the Suburban pulled up to the private terminal at Dulles, Silas was met by a young captain he didn't recognize. The kid looked nervous, his eyes darting around the tarmac. He handed Silas a manila envelope and a one-way ticket to Denver. "Your flight leaves in 20 minutes, sir," the captain said. "I'm sorry about everything." Silas took the envelope. "Who are you, son?" "Captain Reed, sir, I was on the support staff at Landstuhl. I helped Major Vance with the initial blood work." Silas paused, his hand on the door of the plane. He looked the young man in the eye. "Did you see the samples, Reed? The captain looked down at his boots. His jaw worked for a second. "I saw things I can't explain, sir, but the major, she told me to keep a backup, in case the server went down." The air on the tarmac suddenly felt very thin. Silas stepped closer, his voice a low whisper. "Where is it?" "It's not on a server, sir," Reed said, his voice trembling. "She told me to print it. Hard copies. She said data can be deleted, but paper has to be burned. I hid them in the archives of the 212th, under the old casualty reports from 04. Nobody looks there." Silas felt a surge of something he hadn't felt in days. It wasn't hope. It was too cold for that. It was the dark competence of Elena Vance reaching out from the depths of the Atlantic to guide him. She had known. Even back at Landstuhl, before the flight, before the flies, she had known the system would try to erase her. She had built a fail-safe. "Thank you, Captain," Silas said. "She was the best of us, sir," Reed said, his voice breaking. "Everyone in the 212th knows it, no matter what the reports say." Silas nodded once and stepped onto the plane. The flight to Denver was a 6-hour descent into a different kind of purgatory. Silas sat in the back of the small regional jet, the manila envelope heavy on his lap. Inside were his travel orders, his new ID, and a copy of the press release the DoD was preparing to send out. Army Major presumed deceased after in-flight incident. The Department of Defense regrets to announce the loss of Major Elena Vance during a medical transport flight over the North Atlantic. Initial investigations suggest a sudden decompression event led to the Major being ejected from the aircraft. The incident is under review. Major Vance was a decorated officer with 12 years of service. He closed his eyes, hearing the clinical, detached tone of the writing. It was the sound of a machine grinding a human life into a footnote. When he landed in Denver, he was met by another unmarked car and driven 4 hours north into the rugged, desolate beauty of the Wyoming high plains. The landscape was a jagged horizon of red rock and sagebrush, the wind howling across the open spaces with a ferocity that felt personal. The VA facility in Cheyenne was a crumbling, brick-and-mortar relic of the Cold War, tucked away on the edge of town behind a chain-link fence topped with concertina wire. It was a place for the broken, the forgotten, and the inconvenient. Silas was shown to his office, a cramped, windowless room in the basement next to the boiler. It smelled of damp paper and old cigarettes. His desk was a gray metal slab covered in a layer of dust that looked like it had been there since the Bush administration. "Your first appointment start at 0800 tomorrow, Colonel," a tired-looking nurse told him. She didn't look at his rank. She didn't look at his face. She just handed him a stack of folders. "Mostly PTSD cases and chronic pain management. Welcome to the end of the line." Silas sat in the squeaky leather chair and looked at the folders. For a long time, he just sat there, the silence of the basement pressing in on him. He thought about his career. He thought about the clinics in Kabul, the operating theaters in Germany, the thousands of lives he had touched. It was all gone. He was a ghost in a basement, a man whose only job was to prescribe pills and wait for the clock to run out. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the note Elena had given him. Find the others. Don't stop. He looked at the words until they blurred. He knew what the others meant now. It wasn't just other victims of the parasite. It was the others who knew, the people like Captain Reed, the people like the pilot, Miller, the people who were still inside the machine, watching it rot from the inside. He opened the first folder. It was a man named David Holloway, former Staff Sergeant, 75th Ranger Regiment. Medical discharge 2022. Reason, unexplained neurological tremors and chronic fatigue. Silas froze. He looked at the date. The symptoms had started after a deployment to a classified research site in the Horn of Africa. He flipped to the next folder. Corporal Sarah Jenkins, 10th Mountain Division. Medical discharge 2023. Reason, recurrent inflammatory episodes and visual hallucinations. He went through the stack. 10 folders, 10 soldiers, different units, different years, but the same underlying pattern, the same unexplained symptoms, the same clinical language used to dismiss their pain. Silas felt a cold shiver run down his spine. This wasn't a punishment. General Sterling hadn't sent him here to disappear. He had sent him here to see. Sterling was a man of the institution, but he was also a soldier. He couldn't fight Ethelgard from the inside. The hooks were too deep, the rot too pervasive. But he could move the pieces on the board. He could put the only doctor who knew the truth in the one place where the evidence was accumulating like a slow poisoned tide. The VA wasn't the end of the line. It was the front line. Silas leaned back, the leather chair groaning. He looked at the gray metal desk, the dusty folders, and the flickering fluorescent light overhead. He felt a sudden, fierce surge of clarity. Elena hadn't died for nothing. She had bought him time. She had given him the map, and Sterling, in his own cowardly, institutional way, had given him the keys to the kingdom. The personal cost was still there, a jagged hole in his heart where his friend used to be. But the dark competence was starting to take over. He wasn't just a doctor anymore. He was a collector of secrets. 3 days later, the first of the survivors from the C-17 arrived. It was Henderson, the corporal Elena had saved with the duct tape and the bolus. He looked terrible. His skin was the color of ash, and his hands were shaking so hard he had to tuck them under his armpits to keep them still. He was escorted by 2 men in suits who didn't look like VA security. They looked like the men from Fort Detrick. "The patient is under a restrictive medical protocol, Colonel," one of the suits said, standing in the doorway of the small examination room. "You are to observe and record symptoms only. No blood draws, no unauthorized medication, no private conversations." Silas didn't look at the suit. He looked at Henderson. The boy was staring at him with a mixture of terror and recognition. "Go wait in the hall," Silas said, his voice flat. "We have orders to remain." "I'm a colonel in the United States Army and a board-certified physician," Silas snapped, standing up and towering over the man. "Unless you have a medical degree and a higher rank than mine, you will stand on the other side of that door while I examine my patient. If you have a problem with that, you can call General Sterling's office and tell him I'm refusing to comply with a direct medical order." The suit hesitated, his eyes narrowing. He looked at his partner, then back at Silas. "5 minutes, Colonel. That's all you get." They stepped out and closed the door. Silas moved immediately. He didn't go for the stethoscope. He went for the boy's hand. He gripped it hard, feeling the tremors vibrating through the corporal's bones. "Henderson," he whispered, "look at me." The boy's eyes flickered up. They were clouded, the pupils dilated until the irises were just a thin ring of blue. "Doc, where is she? Where's the major?" "She's gone, son," Silas said, his heart breaking for the 100th time. "But she's the reason you're alive. Do you understand? She saved you." "They're telling us we're sick," Henderson whispered, his voice a ragged breath. "They're telling us we had a reaction to a vaccine, but I remember, Doc, I remember the wings. I remember the smell of her perfume when she was sewing me up. It smelled like lavender and antiseptic." Silas felt a lump in his throat. Elena never wore perfume. It was the soap she used, a specific cheap brand from the PX. The fact that the boy remembered that detail through the haze of the parasite and the trauma was a miracle. "They're going to try to make you forget," Silas said, leaning in close, his face inches from Henderson's. "They're going to give you pills that make the world go gray. They're going to tell you that what you saw wasn't real, but it was. I was there. I saw it too." "What do I do, Doc?" "You wait," Silas said. "You stay strong. You talk to the others. Tell them I'm here. Tell them we haven't forgotten the major." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, portable digital recorder he'd bought at a radio shack on the way into town. He slipped it into Henderson's hand. "Hide this," Silas said. "Record everything. The doctors, the nurses, the things they say when they think you're asleep. Can you do that?" Henderson's fingers closed over the plastic. The tremors seemed to steady for a moment. "Yes, sir." "Good boy." Silas stood up just as the door clicked open. The suits were back, their faces tight with suspicion. "Time's up, Colonel." Silas watched them lead the boy away. He felt a cold, hard resolve settling into his gut. The institution thought they had won. They thought they had neutralized the threat by scattering the witnesses and burying the leader. But they didn't understand the nature of the fire Elena Vance had lit. It wasn't a bonfire. It was a slow burn, a subterranean heat that moved through the roots. He spent the next week in a state of hyper-focused labor. He saw 30 patients, all of them veterans of classified operations. He took meticulous notes, not in the official files, but in a small, leather-bound journal he kept strapped to his ankle. He looked for the common thread, the signature of the asterisk leptoplasmodium asterisk in its dormant, long-term phase. He found it in the scarring on their retinas. He found it in the specific way their white blood cell counts fluctuated with the moon cycles. He found it in the stories of the things they had seen in the dark corners of the world. Ethelgard wasn't just a contractor. They were a harvester. They had been using the U.S. military as a giant global petri dish for decades, testing the parasite in small batches, refining the protocol until it was ready for the mass emergence Elena had stopped. And then the letter arrived. It wasn't sent to the VA. It was left on the windshield of Silas's truck at 3 in the morning. It was a plain white envelope with no return address. Inside was a single photograph and a set of coordinates. The photograph was of a beach, a rocky, desolate stretch of coastline somewhere in the North Atlantic. In the center of the frame, half buried in the sand, was a piece of green flight suit. Silas felt the world tilt. He gripped the steering wheel, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. He looked at the coordinates. They led to a small island off the coast of Maine, a place called Blackwood Spit. He knew it was a trap. He knew that the moment he left Cheyenne, he would be a target. The NDAs he had signed were a leash, and the coordinates were the jerk that would snap his neck. But he also knew that he couldn't stay in the basement. He looked at the photograph again. The piece of flight suit had a patch on the shoulder. It was the 212th Medical Detachment, Elena's unit. He didn't hesitate. He went back into the VA, packed his journal, his recorder, and a small medical kit. He didn't leave a note. He didn't say goodbye to the tired nurse. He just walked out the door and into the Wyoming wind. The drive east was a blur of caffeine and paranoia. Silas avoided the interstates, sticking to the two-lane blacktops that cut through the heart of the country. He slept in the truck, his hand on the handle of a 9mm Beretta he'd kept from his time in the service. He felt like a fugitive, but for the first time in years, he felt like a soldier. He reached the coast of Maine on a Thursday evening. The air was thick with the smell of salt and rotting kelp, a scent that made his skin crawl with the memory of the Atlantic jump. Blackwood Spit was a narrow finger of land that reached out into the cold, gray water like a reaching hand. It was accessible only by a single, winding dirt road that was currently washed out by the tide. Silas parked the truck and started to walk. The wind was a howling gale, whipping the spray from the waves into a stinging mist that coated his glasses. He hiked for 3 miles, his old knees screaming with every step until he reached the coordinates. It was a small, weather-beaten shack tucked into the lee of a granite cliff. There were no lights, no signs of life, just the sound of the ocean and the whistling of the wind through the cracks in the wood. Silas drew his pistol and kicked the door open. The room was empty, save for a single wooden chair and a small, portable radio sitting on a crate. The radio was humming, a low, static-filled frequency that sounded like a heartbeat. "Elena," Silas whispered, his voice cracking. The radio crackled. A voice came through the static, not the synthesized voice of Ethelgard and not the calm, surgical voice of Elena Vance. It was Miller, the pilot. "Colonel Thorne, you took your time." Silas lowered the gun, his heart pounding. "Miller, where are you? Where's the major?" "She's not here, Silas," Miller's voice said, sounding tired and far away. "She's never coming back, but she left something for you under the floorboards in the corner." Silas moved to the corner of the shack and pried up the loose boards. Beneath them was a small, waterproof Pelican case. He pulled it out and snapped the latches. Inside was a laptop, a satellite phone, and a single, sealed glass vial. The vial was filled with a clear, shimmering liquid. It looked like water, but when the light hit it, it glowed with a faint, iridescent violet hue. "What is this?" Silas asked, his voice trembling. "The cure," Miller said. "She didn't just jump with the data, Silas. She jumped with the vaccine she'd been working on in secret since the first outbreak in Helmand. She knew they'd try to kill her for it, so she made herself the delivery system. She infected herself with the parasite and the vaccine at the same time. She was the filter." Silas stared at the vial. He understood now. The extraordinary capability Elena had possessed wasn't just medical skill, it was her own biology. She had turned her body into a laboratory, using her own immune system to refine the antibodies until the vaccine was stable. "Where is she, Miller?" "She's at the bottom of the ocean, Silas," Miller said, his voice breaking. "She didn't survive the jump, the impact. It broke her, but the case stayed buoyant. I saw it hit the water. I saw where it drifted. I've been tracking it for weeks." Silas slumped against the wall of the shack, the weight of the revelation crushing him. She was gone, really gone. The hope he had been nursing, the secret prayer that she had somehow swum to shore, was dead. "Why me?" he asked. "Why did she send for me?" "Because you're the only one left who can synthesize it," Miller said. "And because she knew you wouldn't stop. The fleet is coming, Silas, Ethelgard. They're not just a company anymore. They've moved into the next phase. They're going to release the strain in the D.C. metro area in 48 hours. They're calling it a natural mutation. They're going to use it to declare martial law and take control of the vaccine distribution." "I can't do this alone," Silas said, looking at the vial. "I don't have a lab. I don't have the equipment." "You have the others," Miller said. "Look out the window." Silas turned and looked out the small, salt-crusted window of the shack. Coming down the dirt road, their headlights cutting through the mist, were 4 vehicles. A Chevy Suburban, a beat-up Ford F-150, and 2 military surplus HMMWVs. They stopped at the edge of the cliff. The doors opened and people started to get out. There was Captain Reed from Landstuhl. There was the lieutenant from the C-17 cockpit. There were half a dozen Rangers, including Henderson, their faces grim and determined in the pale light. And in the lead was General Raymond Sterling. He wasn't in uniform. He was wearing a heavy flannel shirt and jeans, a hunting rifle slung over his shoulder. He looked like a man who had finally decided which side of the war he was on. He walked up to the shack and stepped inside. He looked at Silas, then at the vial in his hand. "Colonel," Sterling said, his voice quiet, "I believe you have a mission to finish." Silas looked at the general. He looked at the Rangers standing in the cold Maine wind. He looked at the laptop and the satellite phone. He felt the presence of Elena Vance in the room, not as a ghost, but as a blueprint. She had built this. She had seen the failure of the institution and the corruption of the command, and she had built a new one. A shadow military, a brotherhood of the truth. The personal cost was absolute. She was dead. He was a fugitive. His life as he knew it was over. But as he looked at the vial, Silas Thorne felt a strange, cold sense of hope. It was small, it was quiet, but it was alive. "Where do we start?" Silas asked. Sterling looked out at the dark, hungry ocean. "We start with the man who signed the Ethelgard contract. He's in a bunker under the Pentagon, and he thinks we're all dead." Silas nodded. He closed the Pelican case and stood up. The reckoning was no longer a quiet thing happening behind closed doors. It was a storm, and they were the center of it. As they walked out of the shack and toward the waiting vehicles, a single purple-winged fly landed on the salt-crusted window. It vibrated its wings once, a low, subsonic hum that vanished into the roar of the waves. The fly was dying. The cold was too much. The salt was too much. But inside the shack, the iridescent liquid in the vial continued to glow, a tiny, defiant light in the heart of the darkness. Part 4 didn't end with a medal ceremony. It didn't end with a court-martial. It ended with a man and a vial standing on a cliff in the middle of a storm, getting ready to burn the world down to save it. The final reckoning was coming, and for the first time, the people who had started the fire were the ones who should be afraid. Silas climbed into the back of the Suburban. He looked at Henderson, who was sitting next to him, his hand steady on a rifle. "You ready, son?" Silas asked. Henderson looked at him, his eyes clear and cold. "The Major told me to stay strong, Doc. I'm not going to let her down." The engines roared to life, and the small convoy turned away from the ocean and headed back toward the heart of the country. The road ahead was long, and the enemy was everywhere. But they had the data. They had the cure. And they had the memory of a woman who had shown them what it meant to be a soldier. The story of Elena Vance was no longer a tragedy. It was an anthem, and the first notes were just beginning to play. The tires of the Suburban hummed against the rain-slicked asphalt of I-95, a rhythmic, hypnotic vibration that felt like a countdown Silas Thorne could feel in his teeth. Outside the tinted windows, the American Northeast blurred into a smear of gray industrial parks and skeletal autumn trees, the kind of landscape that looked lonely even when it was crowded. Inside the vehicle, the air was thick with the scent of wet wool, gun oil, and the sharp, metallic tang of the portable refrigerator unit humming between Silas's feet. He didn't move. He sat with his hands folded over his knees, his eyes fixed on the small digital readout of the cooling unit. 8 degrees Celsius. The margin for error was non-existent. If the temperature dropped below 0, the proteins in Elena's vaccine would fracture. If it rose above 5, the viral vectors would degrade into useless sludge. It was a fragile, shimmering miracle, housed in a glass vial no larger than a thumb, and it was currently the only thing standing between the American public and a biological extinction event. General Sterling sat in the front passenger seat, his silhouette a rigid, unyielding shadow against the passing headlights of the morning commute. He hadn't spoken since they left Maine. He didn't need to. The way he checked his watch every 10 minutes, the way his hand hovered near the radio, the way he watched the rearview mirror. It was the behavior of a man who knew he was officially a traitor to the hierarchy he had spent 40 years defending. He was no longer a general in the eyes of the Pentagon. He was a rogue element, a ghost in the machine, and if the men in the black Suburbans behind them were signaled, Sterling would be the first one they neutralized. "We're entering the D.C. corridor," the driver whispered. He was a sergeant named Kalo, one of the Rangers who had been on the C-17. His voice was steady, but Silas could see the way his knuckles were white on the steering wheel. Traffic is backing up at the Baltimore Tunnel. We're going to lose 15 minutes. Stay on the 295, Sterling said, his voice a low, gravelly command. Avoid the tunnels. I don't want to be boxed in. Silas leaned back, the leather seat creaking. He closed his eyes, and for a second the humming of the tires transformed into the roar of the C-17's engines. He could see Elena Vance standing on the ramp, the wind whipping her hair into a dark halo, her face illuminated by the flickering red emergency lights. She hadn't looked like a martyr then. She had looked like a woman finishing a job. He remembered the specific weight of her hand on his shoulder when she pushed him back, the strength of it, the absolute certainty of her movement. She had known exactly what she was doing. She had turned herself into a vessel, a biological filter, gambling her life on the hope that her immune system would survive long enough to map the cure into her own marrow. The cost of that gamble was currently sitting in a cooler at Silas's feet, and the cost of her success was her life. He felt a sudden, sharp spike of grief, the kind that hits like a physical blow to the solar plexus. It wasn't the loud, theatrical grief of a funeral. It was the quiet, suffocating realization that he would never again hear her argue about the correct way to suture a femoral artery, or see her drink a cup of terrible, lukewarm coffee while staring at a stack of casualty reports. She was a ghost now, a sequence of data and antibodies, and he was the only one who could give those things a voice. "You okay, Doc?" Henderson asked from the seat beside him. The corporal was holding a short-barreled carbine across his lap, his eyes scanning the traffic behind them. He looked older than he had in Wyoming. The gray tint of the parasite's shadow was still under his skin, but there was a new hardness in his gaze, a focus that suggested he had found something to believe in that was bigger than his own survival. "I'm fine," Silas said, though the word felt like a lie. "Just thinking about the lab. We need a level 4 environment to start the synthesis, Sterling. You said you had a contact at Uzumriad." "I have a contact," Sterling said, not turning around. "But the facility is locked down. Ethelgard has their own security contractors on the perimeter. We aren't going to be invited in, Silas. We're going to have to take the space." "You're talking about an armed assault on a federal laboratory," Silas said. "I'm talking about a reclamation," Sterling countered. "The people inside that building are scientists. Most of them are decent men and women who don't know their data is being funneled to a private board of directors. We show them the vial. We show them the data from Landstuhl. We tell them what's coming for their families. They'll open the doors." "And the Ethelgard contractors?" Sterling finally turned his head. His eyes were cold, 2 chips of flint in a face carved from granite. "The Rangers will handle the contractors. Your job is the science, Silas. You focus on the glass. Let me focus on the steel." The convoy veered off the main highway, cutting through the backstreets of Maryland toward the sprawling, high-security complex of Fort Detrick. The air was turning cold, a biting autumn wind kicking up leaves that skittered across the pavement like tiny, frantic animals. Silas watched the familiar landmarks pass, the chain-link fences, the guarded gates, the massive, windowless blocks of the research buildings. This was the heart of the American Biological Defense Program, a place built on the promise of protection, and it had been turned into a production line for a nightmare. They stopped at a secondary gate, a small, gravel-strewn entrance used for waste disposal and heavy equipment. A lone MP stood in the booth, his breath frosting in the air. Sterling rolled down his window. He didn't show an ID. He didn't say a word. He just looked at the young MP, a kid who couldn't have been more than 20, and waited. The kid's eyes went wide. He looked at the stars on Sterling's shoulders, then at the grim-faced men in the back of the Suburban. He knew the general was supposed to be in D.C. He knew there was a bolo out for a rogue medical officer. But he also saw the way Sterling held himself, the absolute bone-deep authority of a man who had earned his rank in the dirt. The MP didn't pick up the radio. He hit the button for the gate. "Thank you, son," Sterling said quietly as the bar rose. They moved through the complex with a surgical, terrifying efficiency. They didn't go for the main entrance. They drove straight to the loading docks of Building 470, the anthrax tower of the old days, now a modernized, high-containment suite. The moment the Suburban stopped, the doors flew open. The Rangers moved like shadows, their movements synchronized and silent. They weren't shouting orders. They were executing a dance they had practiced 1,000 times in the dark. Henderson led the way, his carbine tucked into his shoulder, clearing the corners with a smooth, lethal grace. Silas grabbed the cooler. The weight of it was substantial, a physical reminder of the burden he was carrying. He followed the Rangers into the loading bay, the smell of diesel and industrial disinfectant hitting him like a wall. Movement, left, someone hissed. A group of 3 men in charcoal gray tactical gear, Ethelgard's security, stepped out from behind a stack of crates. They were better equipped than the MPs, wearing high-end plate carriers and carrying customized rifles. They didn't look like soldiers. They looked like professional killers. "Drop it!" The lead contractor shouted, his weapon coming up. He didn't finish the sentence. Henderson was faster, not because he was younger, but because he was fighting for something real. He didn't fire his weapon. He closed the distance in 3 blurred steps and drove the butt of his carbine into the man's throat, then swept his legs. The other 2 contractors hesitated, a fatal mistake when facing Rangers. Within seconds, they were on the ground, zip-tied and gagged, their weapons stripped. "Go, Doc," Henderson said, gesturing toward the heavy steel doors of the elevator. "We'll hold the bay." Silas, Sterling, and Captain Reed stepped into the elevator. The silence as the doors closed was absolute, broken only by the hum of the motor. Sterling looked at the floor indicator, level 4, the basement. "If we're wrong about the scientists, Silas," Sterling said, staring at the closed doors, "this is where it ends. They'll hit the alarm, the containment seal will drop, and we'll be buried in 5 feet of reinforced concrete before we can say a word." "We're not wrong," Silas said, his hand tightening on the handle of the cooler. "They are Americans, Raymond. They didn't sign up for this." The elevator chimed. The doors slid open to reveal a pressurized airlock and a wall of glass. Behind the glass, 4 people in blue Tyvek suits were working over a series of incubators. They looked up, their faces pale behind their plastic visors. Sterling stepped forward, pressing his hand against the glass. He didn't look like a threat. He looked like a man seeking sanctuary. One of the scientists, an older woman with sharp, intelligent eyes, approached the intercom. "General Sterling, what is the meaning of this? This wing is under a level 5 quarantine by order of the Secretary of Defense." "The Secretary of Defense is being lied to, Doctor." "Aris," Sterling said, his voice amplified by the intercom. "And so are you. I have Colonel Silas Thorne with me. He was at Landstuhl. He was on the C-17. The woman's eyes flickered to Silas. She knew his name. In the small, insular world of military pathology, names like Silas Thorne and Elena Vance were legendary. "They told us you were deceased, Colonel," she said. "They said there was a decompression event. They said the Major. They said she took her own life." "She didn't," Silas said, stepping up to the glass. "She gave her life to build this." He held up the vial. The iridescent liquid caught the harsh, fluorescent light of the airlock, shimmering with that unearthly violet glow. "This is the 212 Delta strain," Silas said. "The vaccine. Elena Vance synthesized it inside her own body. She jumped with it to keep it out of Ethelgard's hands. I have the data logs from her internal telemetry. I have the blood work from the survivors." Dr. Aris stared at the vial. For a long, agonizing minute, the only sound was the rhythmic hiss of the air filtration system. Silas could see the gears turning in her head, the conflict between the orders she had been given and the scientific truth staring her in the face. "Open the door, Sarah," Sterling said, before the men who are really in charge of this facility realize we're here. She looked at her colleagues. They were watching her, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope. She didn't ask for a vote. She reached out and hit the manual override. The airlock hissed as the pressure equalized. Silas stepped into the lab, the scent of ozone and sterile plastic filling his lungs. It felt like coming home. This was his world, a world of pipettes and centrifuges, of cold logic and hard evidence. "How much time do we have?" Dr. Aris asked, her voice tight with professional focus. "Ethelgard plans to release the aerosolized strain in D.C. in less than 36 hours, Silas said, setting the cooler on a stainless steel bench. "They're going to frame it as a mutation of the original parasite. We need to stabilize this sample and begin the rapid culture process. We need 1 million doses." "1 million?" She laughed, a dry, stressed sound. "Colonel, even with the full capacity of this lab, we can only produce 10,000 doses every 12 hours. "Then we don't produce the whole vaccine," Silas said, his mind racing. "We produce the messenger RNA bridge. We use the existing flu vaccine infrastructure at Dover and Fort Belvoir. We hijack their own distribution network." "It's a gamble," she said. "It's the only hand we've got," Silas said. He opened the cooler. He took out the vial, his movements precise and steady. He felt Elena's presence in the room, a ghost of a memory guiding his hands. "Asterisk, don't stop, Silas. Asterisk for the next 18 hours, time ceased to exist. Silas worked with a dark competence that felt like a trance. He didn't eat. He didn't drink. He moved from the microscope to the sequencer to the bioreactor, his world narrowing down to the molecular dance of the asterisk leptoplasmodium asterisk antibodies. He watched as the iridescent liquid was broken down, its secrets laid bare by the advanced equipment of the Uzumriad lab. Elena had been a genius. The way she had engineered the vaccine to bind to the parasite's protein sheath was surgical. It wasn't just a cure, it was an executioner. It sought out the purple-winged flies and dismantled their ability to replicate, turning the parasite's own aggressive growth against it. Outside the lab, the world was beginning to fracture. Sterling was on the satellite phone, coordinating with a network of ghosts, officers and NCOs who had seen the rot and were waiting for a reason to fight back. The Rangers were holding the perimeter of Building 470, a small island of resistance in a sea of institutional corruption. Reports were coming in of security exercises, blocking the roads into D.C. The news was showing images of mysterious illnesses in suburban Maryland. The emergence was starting. "We have the master sequence," Dr. Aris shouted over the hum of the centrifuge. "We're uploading it to the secure server at Belvoir now." "They'll try to block the transmission," Sterling said, standing by the door, his rifle in his hand. "They can't," Captain Reed said, his fingers flying across a keyboard in the corner. "I've nested the data in a Priority 1 medical emergency broadcast. If they cut the signal, they cut the entire DoD medical network. They'd be blinding their own hospitals." "How long until the first batch is ready for distribution?" Silas asked, wiping sweat from his forehead. 4 hours, Aris said. "But we have a problem. The Ethelgard security teams have been reinforced. They've brought in a specialized unit from their headquarters in Virginia. They're moving on the building with heavy equipment." Silas looked at the monitors. A fleet of black armored vehicles was rolling across the parade ground toward the lab. Men in full tactical gear were dismounting, setting up breaching charges on the loading dock doors. "They're not going to arrest us," Sterling said, his voice devoid of emotion. "They're going to erase the building. They'll call it a containment breach, a tragic accident." "We need those 4 hours," Silas said. "You'll have them," Sterling said. He looked at Silas, and for a second the mask of the general slipped. He looked like a father looking at a son. "Finish the work, Silas. Make sure she didn't jump for nothing." Sterling turned and walked out of the lab, his boots clicking on the tile. He joined the Rangers in the hallway, his presence a stabilizing force as the first of the breaching charges detonated downstairs. The sound of the explosion rattled the glass of the lab. Silas didn't look up. He focused on the pipette. The next 3 hours were a symphony of violence and science. The building shook with the rhythm of gunfire, the sharp, rhythmic cracks of the Rangers' rifles answering the heavy thud of the contractors' weapons. Silas could hear the shouts in the hallway, the sound of boots on metal stairs, the frantic calls for medics. He knew that every minute he spent over the bench was a minute someone else was paying for in blood. He thought of Henderson. He thought of the young MP at the gate. He thought of the thousands of people in D.C. who were currently waking up to a world that was about to end. "Synthesis complete," Dr. Aris whispered, her voice trembling. "The master batches are being loaded into the transport drones." "Send them," Silas said. The lab had a roof-mounted drone bay, designed for the rapid transport of samples between facilities. It was an automated system, hard-coded into the base's infrastructure. Silas watched the monitor as 6 small, quadcopter drones rose from the roof of Building 470. They carried the blueprint for the cure, the biological key that would unlock the defenses of the American people. They streaked away into the gray morning sky, heading toward the regional hospitals and military bases that had already been alerted by Reed's broadcast. The battle in the hallways was getting closer. The Rangers were being pushed back, their numbers dwindling against the superior firepower of the Ethelgard unit. "They are at the airlock," Reed shouted, drawing a sidearm. The glass wall of the lab shattered as a flashbang detonated in the corridor. Silas was thrown back, his ears ringing, his vision a blur of white light. He scrambled for the floor, his hands searching for the last vial of the master strain, the one he had kept for himself. He felt a hand on his collar, pulling him up. It was Henderson. The boy was covered in soot and blood, his left arm hanging limp at his side, but his eyes were clear. "We have to go, Doc," Henderson rasped. "The general, he's down, he told us to get you out." "The data—" "It's sent," Reed said, grabbing his laptop. "The world knows, Silas, it's over for them." They retreated through the back of the lab into a service tunnel that led to the old steam pipes of the base. It was a dark, cramped space, smelling of rust and ancient heat. Silas clutched the vial to his chest, the glass cold against his skin. They emerged a mile away in a wooded area near the edge of the base. The sun was fully up now, a cold, pale disk hanging over the Potomac. In the distance, Silas could see smoke rising from the center of Fort Detrick. Building 470 was a blackened shell, a monument to the cost of the truth. They didn't stay to watch. They moved through the woods, eventually reaching a prearranged extraction point where a battered Ford F-150 was waiting. The drive away from the base was quiet. Henderson sat in the back, his eyes closed, his breathing shallow. Reed was on the laptop, monitoring the news. "It's happening," Reed whispered. "The hospitals in D.C. are reporting the arrival of the drones. The Surgeon General has issued a national emergency declaration. They are arresting the CEO of Ethelgard. The story is breaking. Silas, all of it. The C-17, the parasite, the cover-up." Silas didn't feel a sense of victory. He felt hollow. He looked at his hands, the hands that had held the vial, the hands that had stitched up Henderson, the hands that would never again hold a surgical tray in a room with Elena Vance. He had won the war, but the cost was a hole in the world that could never be filled. 2 weeks later, the world was a different place. The emergence had been stopped. The natural mutation narrative had collapsed under the weight of the evidence Silas and Reed had released. Ethelgard was being dismantled by a dozen different federal agencies, its board members facing life in prison for treason and crimes against humanity. The army was undergoing a massive purge of its senior leadership, a reckoning that was as painful as it was necessary. Silas Thorne didn't stay for the hearings. He didn't stay for the medals or the press conferences. He returned to Wyoming. The VA facility in Cheyenne was still there, a crumbling brick relic in the wind. But it was different now. The men in suits were gone. The security protocols had been lifted. The survivors from the C-17 were being treated with the respect they deserved, their stories no longer dismissed as hallucinations. Silas sat in his windowless office in the basement. He looked at the folders on his desk. David Halloway, Sarah Jenkins, the names of the forgotten. He was no longer a ghost. He was a doctor again, but he carried something with him that he hadn't carried before. It wasn't a secret or a vial. It was the knowledge of what a human being was capable of when everything else was stripped away. He had seen the absolute darkness of the institution, and he had seen the absolute light of a woman who refused to let it win. He stood up and walked out of the office, moving through the quiet halls of the VA. He stepped out into the crisp Wyoming air. The sun was setting over the high plains, a vast, bleeding red that felt as old as the earth itself. He walked to his truck and drove south toward the Colorado border. He didn't have a destination in mind until he saw the sign for a small roadside cemetery tucked into the lee of a granite ridge. He parked the truck and walked among the headstones. Most of them were old, the names worn away by decades of wind and snow. He found a spot near the edge of the ridge, overlooking the vast, open expanse of the prairie. He knelt down and dug a small hole in the dry, red earth. He took out a small object he had been carrying in his pocket, a simple silver St. Christopher medal. It had belonged to Elena Vance. He had found it in the pocket of her flight suit on the beach in Maine. He placed the medal in the hole and covered it with dirt. He didn't say a prayer. He didn't give a speech. He just stood there, the wind howling around him, the scent of sagebrush and cold air filling his lungs. He thought about the extraordinary capability the world never saw. It wasn't the science or the bravery. It was her ability to look at a broken world and decide that it was still worth saving. He stayed there until the stars came out, a cold, brilliant canopy that made him feel small and infinite all at once. He thought about the Rangers, now back in their barracks, their lives restored. He thought about Sterling, buried with full honors in Arlington, a man who had found his soul at the very end. He thought about himself. He was 60 years old. He had seen more death than any one man should ever have to witness. But as he looked out at the dark horizon, he felt a strange, quiet sense of peace. He had finished the mission. He walked back to his truck, his footsteps heavy but certain. He started the engine and turned on the radio. A country song was playing, a low, melancholy tune about a man heading home after a long journey. He drove back toward Cheyenne, the headlights of the truck cutting through the darkness. The world was still complicated. The institution was still flawed. The cost of the truth was still absolute. But as Silas Thorne looked into the rearview mirror, he didn't see a ghost. He saw a man who knew exactly who he was and what he was for. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper, the note Elena had given him on the ramp. Asterisk, find the others. Don't stop. Asterisk, he looked at the words one last time, then he struck a match and watched the paper curl into ash. He didn't need the reminder anymore. The mission was inside him now. He pulled into the parking lot of the VA, the lights of the facility flickering in the wind. He saw a light on in the isolation wing. Henderson was awake. Silas climbed out of the truck and walked toward the entrance. He felt the weight of his years, the ache of his joints, the scars on his heart. He felt everything, and for the first time in a long time, he was okay with it. He opened the heavy steel door and stepped inside, the scent of industrial floor wax and antiseptic greeting him like an old friend. He walked toward the light, his shadow long and steady on the linoleum. He had a shift to start. There were people who needed him. There was work to be done. And in the quiet, empty spaces of the night, he could almost hear her voice, a faint, surgical whisper in the wind. Asterisk, good job, Silas. Asterisk, he stopped at the nurse's station, nodding to the tired-looking woman behind the desk. She looked up and smiled, a genuine, weary smile that felt like a victory in itself. Coffee's fresh, Colonel, she said. Thanks, Martha, Silas said. He took a cup, the heat of it seeping into his palms. He looked at the clock on the wall. 03:42. He took a sip of the bitter black liquid and headed toward room 104. The wind continued to howl across the Wyoming plains, a restless, hungry sound that spoke of the vastness of the country and the fragility of the people who lived in it. It blew over the red rocks and the sagebrush, over the small cemetery on the ridge, and over the dark, cold waters of the North Atlantic where a piece of green flight suit had once washed ashore. The story was over, but the world was still turning. The cost had been paid in full. Silas Thorne pushed open the door to Henderson's room. The boy looked up, his face illuminated by the soft blue light of the monitors. Hey, Doc, Henderson said. Hey, son, Silas replied. He set his coffee down and picked up the chart. The mission was changed, but the purpose remained the same. The night was long, but the morning was coming, and for the first time in a very long time, Silas Thorne was ready to meet it. He looked out the window at the first faint line of light on the horizon. He was a soldier, and he was home. The mountains stood tall and indifferent against the sky, their peaks catching the first touch of the sun. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk circled, a solitary speck of life in the vast, open blue. Silas turned back to his patient. Everything was exactly as it was supposed to be.